Hello, welcome to Six Part. Today I'm gonna start a new series. What if Deku had none for all? Part 1. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Since a baby in China was born with special gifts, or quirks, society has undergone rapid change. These special gifts, or quirks, have spread throughout the world. Approximately 80% of people are thought to have some sort of quirk. It is inevitable that some people will take advantage of their gifts for their own benefit. They were called villains or criminals. But some courageous, eccentric men and women started risking their lives to fight them and protect the defenseless. These brave individuals were referred to as heroes. Midoriya had dreamed of being a hero since he could remember. His childhood dream was to enroll in the top hero course at UA, but there was only one minor issue with him. In front of the resident class bullies, a 4-year-old Midoriya proclaimed, "If you keep picking on people, then I'll never forgive you." "Even though you're quirkless," the bully's ringleader started to say. He banged his fist against his hand, and his knuckle exploded with embers. "You're pretending to be a hero, Deku?" Yes, exactly. He had no peculiarities. According to statistics, there was a 20% chance that he would be. Additionally, he represented the short end of the stick. He was severely battered as he lay on the ground. One fact echoed in his mind, his eyelids half open, on the verge of consciousness. Not all men are made equal. Midoriya persisted in spite of the words of his skeptics and critics. Why? That was easy, then. Unless you try, you'll never know, right? If he tried and failed, that was one thing. That was something he could live with. But it was unacceptable to give up on his dream without even trying. He wouldn't even consider the idea, in fact. Even though Bakugo said he would definitely get into UA, and his classmates made fun of him for wanting to join the university. He worked day after day toward his dream while speaking down to Midoriya and the other students, suggesting that Midoriya's presence would only make UA look foolish. But one day, after class, things took a different turn, all due to a single incident. Due to a single instance. Midoriya was as eager as ever to write in his hero analysis notebook after class ended. He saw Kamui Woods in action earlier that day, along with Mount Lady, a new and astacular hero. Canyon Cannon, her special attack, seemed to have been especially lethal. Midoriya said to himself, "I can't wait to write about what I saw." However, a hand reached out in front of him to take his notebook before he could put it back in his backpack. Midoriya noticed that it was Bakugo himself when he looked up. Bakugo remarked, "I wasn't done talking to you, Deku." He casually waved Midoriya's book around. Bakugo was approached by two of his friends, or lackeys, as Midoriya liked to call them. One said, What's that notebook?" He was given it by Bakugo. It was too much for the lackey to handle. "Huh? Hero analysis for the future?" Peefed. He burst into uncontrollable laughter. Midoriya's fist clenched. He was starting to feel angry, but he suppressed it. He might actually die if he attempted to fight them right now. His voice was shaky as he demanded, "JJ, just give it back." Bakugo responded by hitting the notebook with his fist. He could have burned it to cinders, but he decided to singe it instead. Then, as his lifelong bully threw his priceless notebook carelessly out of the window, Midoriya gasped in surprise. Bakugo said to him, "Do me a favor, Deku," with a light-hearted smile. He touched the shoulder of Midoriya. "Stay away from UA, nerd." Midoriya remained hopeless as the three bullies started to leave. He clenched both of his fists now. His stomach ached, a furnace of rage that burned white-hot inside him. Usually, he would consider the situation as objectively as possible, balance the advantages and disadvantages, and then take action. However, he started to imagine how amazing it would be to strike Bakugo with all of his might. Only one blow. All he needed was that. He could then pass away contented. "Hey, at least you could say something." A cackle came from one of the lackeys. Bakugo paused to say, "Deku, if you want to have a quirk, there is one thing that you could do. You could go to the highest roof and jump off of it. As you fall, wish with all of your might that you will be reborn with a quirk in the next life." Then Midoriya looked at Bakugo. His rage had boiled up inside him. His face was contorted with anger, and the furnace inside was like a supernova. Bakugo just gave him a sly smile. That expression was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was fascinating. Bakugo put his arms behind his back. "Oh, I like that look that on your Deku," he said. "I'll give you the first punch." Grr. That's all. His opportunity had arrived. Bakugo was hurried by Midoriya. He almost stumbled over his own feet in the process, but he was able to stay upright. He clenched and retracted his right fist. He imitated All Might, his favorite hero, by imagining what he would do. Midoriya clashed his knuckle with Bakugo's cheek and yelled, "Detroit, smash!" Bakugo grunted from the impact, but he didn't move at all. Although Midoriya couldn't read his face from where he was standing, he could see the look on his lackeys' faces, and they were shocked to silence. "Detroit? Smash?" Bakugo whispered to himself. He spoke in a low, nearly unintelligible voice. After the excitement of Midoriya's actions subsided, an overwhelming sense of regret took its place. He was finished. After wiping his mouth, Bakugo turned to face Deku, his eyes emotionless. "Don't make me laugh, Deku." Midoriya was caught off guard. A powerful blow from the right side fell right on his jaw. Midoriya was flung against the classroom wall by the impact and the explosion that was aided by his quirk. The impact nearly knocked him out, but he was still conscious. Bakugo gave his servants the order, "Guard the door, make sure no one wanders in here. I will be out in a second." The two followed instructions. In order to avoid raising suspicions, they left the classroom, closed the door, and stood in front of it talking. Inside, Bakugo's quirk had left Midoriya lying against the wall, his cheek covered in blisters and his lower lip busted and bleeding. Even worse, he was aware of Bakugo's reluctance. He would have actually killed his strange classmate if he hadn't. Bakugo pounded his fist against his hand, just as he had done all those years before. "I'm proud of you, Deku, for finally having the balls to stand up for yourself." "I really am," Bakugo said. "But you chose the wrong one to stand up to." Midoriya would normally beg. He would plead for his life and for forgiveness. However, he no longer had the strength to. Why not express his true feelings if he was going to die anyhow? "You know what?" Midoriya said as he started to slowly get up, leaning on the wall he was leaning against for support. "The funny thing is, if I were in your position, I wouldn't pick on anyone. However, instead, I was born without a quirk, which is something that you feel the need to remind me as much as you can. But I bet without your quirk, you would be nothing," roared Midoriya, looking Bakugo in the eyes. "Quiet." Bakugo's expression was a warped mixture of surprise and wonder. Deku had resisted him twice at that point. What on earth had affected him? And he claimed that without his quirk, he, Katsuki Bakugo, would be nothing? Had he gone insane? "Do you think that I wouldn't be able to kick your ass without my quirk, Deku?" Midoriya did not nod his head or tremble. Bakugo pressed, "Well." After taking a deep breath, Midoriya nodded his head. Without another word, Bakugo remained silent. He just rushed at Midoriya, who was caught off guard. He started punching Midoriya non-stop, starting from his face and moving to his chest and stomach. The oddball boy doubled over in pain after one particular body blow. He collapsed to his knees in pain and threw up his lunch on the floor. After that, Bakugo kicked Midoriya in the head with his reared leg. He blacked out from the force of that blow alone. Hours later, Midoriya woke up in a daze. He wasn't sure where he was at first. However, he recalled that he was still at the school after Bakugo had just kicked him in the ass. He had never before been rendered unconscious. Was it typical for people to remain unconscious for a few hours? And why had nobody noticed that he was still not home? Where had the teachers gone? The tenant, the staff and faculty? Hold on, talking about home. My mother is going to murder me. She was most likely extremely anxious. This realization startled Midoriya, and he stood up shakily. His entire body ached, but his ribs in particular were hurting more than anything he had ever experienced. He nearly slipped on something wet as he made his way to his book bag. He suppressed the urge to throw up again after realizing that it was his own vomit. He's shocked at how badly he was beaten. Did Bakugo intend to murder him? He discovered that his cherished hero analysis notebook was still missing as he rummaged through his backpack to make sure he had everything he needed. He wanted to stay and search for it, but the sun had already set and it was getting late. "I'm hoping that tomorrow his notebook will be found in the lost and found." He started to walk home the way he usually did, but a police barricade stopped him. It seems that All Might was able to rescue a student who had been taken hostage by a slime villain. Midoriya was not given any more information, but he was still a little annoyed that he had been rendered unconscious during the entire ordeal. Even worse was the fact that he had to return home via a different route, which passed through a dubious area of town. Nevertheless, there were more police officers and heroes on patrol as a result of the recent slime villain attack. It should be unlikely that you will run into problems. At last, after what seemed like an eternity, home was only a block away from Midoriya. He was always wary and occasionally looked over his shoulder, but fortunately no one was pursuing him. Sweet home, home. As he carried on with his journey without interruption, he uttered an internal cry. Hey, kid, what's in the backpack? Midoriya stopped. Absolutely not. When he turned, he saw a man standing menacingly in all black with a ski mask covering his face. Absolutely not. He looked everywhere. Always, there was no one in sight. There was no sense to it. Absolutely not. How? The man's body abruptly vanished, then resurfaced in the sight of the oddball boy. Does that answer your question, kid? Midoriya let his backpack fall. Of course. Someone else with a quirk exploiting someone else without one. When would it be over? Hold on, that's it. It doesn't matter if he doesn't possess a quirk. He only needs to shout for assistance, and a quirk-wielding hero will come to his aid. Help! Somebody help me please. I'm being robbed. Midoriya screamed at the top of his lungs as the masked criminal reached for the backpack. Reaching back to brandish a handgun, the criminal yelled, "Shut up, kid," before pointing it at the quirkless student. Although Midoriya was momentarily stunned, he assumed that someone would find him. More police officers and heroes would be on patrol in the area, he was told. He was still within the patrol's range, having been around a dozen blocks away from the slime villain incident. Therefore, he ought to be saved sooner or later. Help! Someone! Anyone! Please! Hell! Whoa! Around the area, there was the deafening sound of a gunshot. With a muttered curse, the criminal fled as quickly as he could. What Midoriya thought was an invisibility or camouflage quirk caused his body to vanish. However, what about him? Okay. No way. The mind-numbing pain in his gut caused him to fall to his knees. He was still in shock, so he was unable to comprehend what had happened to him. But then he realized when he saw the blood seeping from his wound. Someone had shot him. No way. Midoriya gave a shivering scream. He was experiencing unimaginable pain. It reduced the impact of what Bakugo had done to him earlier in the day to a pinch. As he hovered on the brink of awareness, his only thought was, all the heroes are gone. Why is nobody present? When a boy who appeared to be about Midoriya's age said, "Boss, I found something," he had picked up a notebook by chance and held it in his hand. What is it? Inquired the enigmatic man. The boy grinned menacingly and exclaimed, "It's a notebook that has all of the information that you could ever want about almost every hero imaginable. Lucky." The man said, "Oh, does the notebook say who the owner of it is?" The boy flipped through the pages while frantically scratching his head. Although he was unable to locate a name on the cover, he was able to locate one on the final page. It is owned by some kid named Midoriya Izuku. Interesting, said the man. Most interesting. The boy questioned, why does it matter who made it? Because whoever this Midoriya is, he could prove to be quite useful to us. A quirk-free world. It was nice, it was respectable. It was typical, it was remarkably commonplace. Even though life was routine and boring, it was also novel and exciting. Midoriya didn't have to worry about trying to fit in with a culture that denigrated him. Bullies with quirks who picked on the weak and quirkless to boost their egos were non-existent at his school. Even the bullies were normal in this world, which indicated that they could be handled normally. No heroes were present, only law enforcement and police officers. There weren't any villains, just your typical criminals. In this world, Midoriya witnessed his own aspiration to enroll in the police academy in order to become a detective and acquire the skills necessary to solve crimes and assist others. They were respected in their community for the brave men and women who risked their lives every day. They wouldn't be made fun of for lacking quirks, which would make them regulated to serve as villains' food. In fact, their sacrifices would have significance. Everybody would be someone. Midoriya had a dream about that world. With a start, Midoriya opened her eyes. He tried to sit up while staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, but a sharp pain in his stomach stopped him. The realization that he was in a hospital came to him when he turned to look at his mother sleeping on a portion of the bed next to him. Yes, exactly. Someone had shot him. His mother, initially shocked to see her infant son awake, was awakened by his restless movements. But sure enough, tears started streaming down her cheeks and her eyes started to water. Aizuku. She wished she could give him a hug. She wanted to hold him, caress him, and relieve all of his suffering, but she was unable to do so. She leaned in and started repeatedly pecking his cheek because she was afraid that if she gave him a hug, she would hurt him. In between kisses, she exclaimed, "Izuku, I'm so happy that you're awake. Oh baby, I'm so happy, I'm so happy." It was impossible for Midoriya not to smile. "Is there anything that you need from me?" Do you want me to fetch the nurse to give you something to eat? Do you want me to fluff your pillow? How about I sit your bed up a little bit? Midoriya said. Well, I'd like to sit up a bit. Yes, of course, his mother said, pressing a button on the hospital bed's side. The bed's head started to rise until it came to a stop at a roughly 30-degree angle. This is fine, thank you, Midoriya replied. To be honest, he wished he could be raised a bit more, but he was afraid of aggravating his wound. He wasn't in any pain at the moment, but that might have been because he was given new painkillers during his presumed surgery. Since there were no intravenous lines attached to him, the bullet must have been extracted without incident. That was what he had hoped anyway. The two were silent for a moment before his mother spoke once more. Oh, I almost forgot. Midoriya arched an eyebrow at his mother as she took out her cell phone from her purse. His mother handed her phone to her son, who took it and started reading the message his father had left. Your father called to check up on you throughout the night. You were in surgery for more than 16 hours and he took off of work to stay on the phone with me throughout the whole ordeal. He had to go back to work but he left you a message. Here, read it, his mother said. Words cannot describe your strength, son. I have faith that you will persevere and that you will emerge stronger as a result. Gosh, my son will be the toughest person there is, I thought as I gazed down at you for the first time while I was holding you in my arms. I have no doubt that you will succeed in whatever you set your mind to, quirk or not. You are incredibly bright and intelligent. I recall the moment you walked for the first time. Even though you repeatedly fell, you always got back up quickly. As it turned out, the first time you took a few steps, you moved so quickly that you began to run rather than just walk. You have no fear and can accomplish anything you set your mind to. I'm confident you'll get into UA and turn into a great hero. Please try your best until next summer, when I should be returning home. Who knows, perhaps we could accompany each other on patrol. And never forget that you are my hero forever, Dad, love. As he returned the phone to his mother, Midoriya wiped away his tears. Although he was pleased that his father had left such a positive message, he had to accept reality. Imagine what a villain would do if a thug with a gun and a camouflage quirk could nearly kill him. He would be destroyed. It was simply not a realistic dream to be a hero. Midoriya started to say, Mom, as he wiped the last of the tears from his eyes. Yes, honey? His mother inquired, her expression alert. I don't want to go to UA anymore. His mother let out a startled gasp. But honey, I don't want to be a hero anymore. But what about your Drea, Mom? Look at me, yelled Midoriya. It was the first time in his life that he had ever yelled at his mother. His mother attempted to attribute it to the stress and trauma of her son's experience, but she couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was about to happen. He pulled up his hospital gown to show the scars from the bullet he took to his gut. Don't you see, Mom? I can't do it, it's not possible. I don't have a quirk to defend myself. All I'll be doing is going out on patrol every day to die, he said. His eyes were still welling with tears as he finally spoke out loud what everyone had been wanting to tell him since the beginning. I am nothing without a quirk. With her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably, Midoriya's mother hurried out of the room, devastated to hear her son speak in such a manner. He buried his face in his hands, regret piercing his chest like a knife. He said to himself, "What's wrong with me?" out loud. After a short pause, a nurse entered the room and shut the door behind her. It seems almost unbelievable how young she must have looked. Her smile was so warm it could light up a mineshaft. She questioned him, "Is everything all right, Mr. Midoriya?" Midoriya let out a sigh. The nurse must have witnessed his mother's frantic exit from the clinic. Although he felt terrible about what he had said, he was unable to retract it. He told the nurse, "Why yay, please don't worry yourself about it," which made her laugh. She smiled and corrected him, saying, "I should be the one worrying about you, you know." The eccentric boy gave her a sheepish smile in response. Even now, his only thought was that he couldn't burden other people. He did not allow his circumstances to make him resentful. Midoriya was approached by the nurse, who leaned in to speak to him. All he could do was close his eyes as tightly as he could to avoid looking at her breasts, but he had no idea what she was trying to do. When he did, he heard her giggle, and she straightened his bedsheet and fluffed out his pillow for him. "I just wanted to fluff your pillow, silly," she said. She pushed her blonde bangs to the side and asked, "Unless you wanted me to do something else?" There was a sultry and seductive tone to her voice. Midoriya's cheeks flushed red and her soft lips puckered out. Sputtered, No, I'm fine, really, thank you," he said. "She's very near," her breath was practically tickling his neck. She started to say, "Well, in that case, I have a question for you," as she leaned closer. Her hand slithered up his leg and up toward his abdomen. Midoriya felt. She traced the outline of his staple-sealed wound with her finger. Yet he still winced when he made contact because he felt a slight unease. The nurse leaned in to whisper in Midoriya's ear, her face darkening. She inquired, "How did it feel when you were shot?" The color of Midoriya's cheeks turned white. No, what sort of nurse? Who the hell would ask someone that question? Before he felt her hand move to his chest, he was stunned to silence. He gave a muffled moan as a chill ran down his spine. He was intoxicated by everything about her, including her voice, body warmth, and scent. Her touch jolted his nerves and opened his senses, and she jump-started his body. What was happening? What was she doing? Her breath tickled his neck as she asked, "Please describe it to me." Midoriya was inspired to speak by the feeling. It was like fire in my stomach, he uttered without strength, recalling the experience. The nurse responded in a high-pitched voice, imitating a woman who was close to her sexual peak. "Yay?" she said. And Midoriya swallowed softly. How on earth was he doing this? Why was he making fun of this? He felt as though he was experiencing an out-of-body sensation, but he didn't want to do this. He was unable to restrain himself. And it was like being branded on the inside. "Yes. Thank you so much," she said, tracing her hand down his chest again before meeting Midoriya's eyes. The nurse cooed, "I love bad boys like you," before abruptly pulling back to get herself straight. She waved goodbye to the eccentric boy Devilshi and said, "Let's do this again sometime," as she left the room. Midoriya let out a breath and rested his head fully on his pillow. What on earth just took place? Hours passed quickly as Midoriya considered what he would do after leaving the hospital. It would be impossible for him to be a hero, but could he still be a police officer? Although it was still a risky job, he might eventually become a detective or even pursue a career in forensics. In this manner, he can assist others without endangering himself. It was possibly the only way he could help heroes without feeling like he was getting in the way of them. The door to his room opened, and he sighed again. When the previous nurse intervened, Midoriya's face instantly flushed. His eyes glistened as she laughed at his expression and moved aside to reveal his mother and another special visitor. The man smiled brightly and said, "How are you doing, young man?" Midoriya saw a man he had always admired as a child standing in front of him. He ranked as the world's greatest hero. The height of manliness and a ray of hope for everyone, he was. All Might. He laughed arrogantly and remarked, "I'm happy to see that my humble reputation has spread to someone even as strong as yourself." Then, as Midoriya watched with his mouth open, the hero put a hand on his mother's shoulder. Hold on, did All Might just describe him as strong? The might of all? All Might walked up to Midoriya and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "This gorgeous young woman came to my agency begging me to speak to her son who was recovering from a bullet wound. She told me that you were down in the dumps and pleaded with me to speak to you since I was your #1 hero. But she got it all wrong," All Might said. "I came here to say that you are now my #1 hero, Izuku Midoriya." Midoriya was at a loss for words. He was only able to cry uncontrollably and smile like a total idiot. A feeling of self-worth and validation overcame him. He felt uneasy about it. Who was he to inspire admiration in others? He was treated like a nobody his entire life. As though he had no value. He, of all people, was his hero, according to All Might himself. "Don't give up on your dream, young Midoriya. You can become a hero," All Might guaranteed him, grinning brightly and giving him his trademark thumbs up. Midoriya shook his head and wiped away his tears. "It's okay, really. I'm fine with the way things are. That is, with me not going to UA," he replied. He was asked by his mother, "Are you sure?" Seeing her son give up on his dreams was heartbreaking. From the moment he could speak, he spoke only of being a hero. Midoriya gave a nod. "Yes. I've decided to join the police academy instead and become a cadet." All Might gave him a radiant smile. "Excellent choice. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask me, young Midoriya." The boy said, "Oh okay," and nodded. The fact that his idol All Might would be there to mentor him whenever he needed him meant more to him than he could express. "Young lady, you know where to find me, and you have my number. Please send young Midoriya to me as soon as he is discharged from the hospital," All Might said to Midoriya's mother. The question that kept coming to mind was, "Wait, what do you want me to see you for?" All Might gave him a wink. "It's a secret." He then laughed heartily and left the room with the nurse, leaving his mother and himself alone once more. Said Midoriya first. As he tried to make sense of his emotional state at the moment, his voice trailed off. "I'm sorry, Mom, for yelling at you." I promise that I won't do it again. Never in his life had he felt both so angry and so powerless. It's okay, honey, his mother reassured him. I understand. You've been through quite a lot. Visiting hours are about to end, so I have to go, but please try to get some rest. Midoriya gave her a smile. Yes, ma'am. Midoriya closed his eyes and fell asleep after his mother kissed him goodbye and departed. Well. Well. Interesting. Yes, this is most interesting. What? With a start, Midoriya opened her eyes. Since it was night, the lights were turned down, making it difficult for him to see. But he thought he might have heard someone talk. Ah, I see that you are awake now, Izuku Midoriya. Who what? He could see nothing, but it sounded like the person was sitting directly across from him. But his room's door opened, and his nurse entered with a broad smile on her face. Oh boo. And here I was about to have a little more fun with our resident bad boy, she said. However, it seemed as though her skin was literally melting off of her body as she spoke. Midoriya tried to sit up in alarm, but he lacked the strength to do so. He felt as though his whole body had been paralyzed. What's going on? He exclaimed in panic. Ah, I see the local anesthetic has kicked in, the nurse said. She didn't appear to be a nurse, though. Once she had shedded the skin of the nurse she was posing as, a school-aged girl with wild, unruly, dirty blonde hair and sharp eyes that matched her wide, sadistic smile was exposed beneath the disguise. What is this? Exclaimed Midoriya. Was this dream he was having? Was he having a bad dream? He was looking for answers. He was perplexed. Who was she? She was pretending to be his nurse, but why? What did she do? Did she have a quirk? Was she playing the role of his nurse all along? Why? The enigmatic husky voice called out to him, this is just a job interview. The nurse, or, as Midoriya would prefer to call her, a crazy schoolgirl, came over to the side of his bed where his lamp was and switched it on. To Midoriya's horror, a man sat with his legs crossed in front of him, wearing a three-piece black suit and what he could only assume was a faceless mask held up by a breathing apparatus. In his hands was a notebook he knew well. The Hero Analysis for the Future notebook, huh? This has been a most interesting read so far, said the man. His tone was one of genuine admiration. How did you get that? Sputtered Midoriya. The fact that he was immobile and lacked the strength to scream for assistance irritated him. It would have been a bad idea, I must say. He and everyone else on his floor would perish if he let out a scream. Fast, and in silence. And who are you? The enigmatic man sat forward in his chair nearer the light after uncrossing his leg. In the light he was just as frightening as he was in the dark. My name is All for One, and I am here to speak to the mastermind behind this notebook, Izuku Midoriya. Is it All for One? There was nothing familiar about the name. Wait a minute, mastermind? Sputtered Midoriya. That's right, the man remarked while flipping through Midoriya's laptop. So much valuable information. There were some things in here that not even I had known about. I am not an easy man to impress, but I must say, I am impressed, Izuku Midoriya. Midoriya swallowed. Whoever this guy was, he was clearly trouble. In that instance, a criminal was in possession of his notebook. Or worse, an antagonist. Unfortunately, that meant that a hero would be held accountable for his recklessness if he were to suffer any harm as a result of the information he wrote in his notebook. Did he intend to recruit him, though, since he stated that he was only here to perform a job interview? But why? Midoriya started by asking, you mentioned earlier that this was a job interview, right? His voice was less tremulous than it had been. At least he was aware that there was no imminent threat to his life. He might be able to get enough information to bring to All Might in order to stop this. All for One guy if he obeyed him and pretended to agree with everything he said. That is correct, All for One said, reclining in his chair and crossing his leg to find a comfortable position. I have a few questions to ask you, if you don't mind. As though I have an option. To himself, Midoriya thought. I don't mind at all, the boy said. All for One then raised one finger and said, great, then let's get started, shall we? Question number 1. What are your parents' quirks? Why does that matter? He gave an honest response, saying, my dad can breathe fire, and my mom can pull small objects to herself. Lying, he reasoned, might be a mistake that cost him his life. All for One gave a head nod. He raised 2 fingers and said, I see. Question number 2. What is your quirk? Before he could answer, Midoriya bit his lip. I don't have one, was his feeble response. All for One remarked, interesting. I figured as much. Only someone without a quirk would spend the vast majority of their time hyper-analyzing the quirks of others, wouldn't you agree? That makes sense, I suppose. Midoriya gave a nod. All for One said, now then, and held up 3 fingers. Question number 3. Would you like to have a quirk? What? Midoriya's mouth dropped open and his eyes widened. Huh? I said, would you like to have a quirk? Midoriya fumbled for the correct words. Was the question posed to him hypothetical? For me, All Might's quirk would be the one he would pick if he could have any quirk in the world. Maybe something like what his mother did, but on a larger scale, could be done if that wasn't feasible. However, a world free from choice was what he truly desired, where his value was determined by the strength of his character rather than the strength of his quirk. His chances of being born without a quirk were about 20%, and sure enough, he was born without one. Instead of fighting against his lot in life, perhaps he should just learn to accept it. Not just him, but many others had to. He might be able to move on to something else sooner if he accepted it sooner. With all of these ideas racing through his head, Midoriya fixed All for One with a determined gaze. The words, "I have to decline your offer, Mr. All for One," were spoken by Midoriya. The enigmatic man had no facial features, so Midoriya was unable to determine whether or not his response surprised him. He said, "Oh, and why is that?" He also didn't sound surprised based on his voice. He said, but Midoriya had no idea why. He certainly did not trust his nurse, or All for One. But it felt good to put his thoughts into words. It felt natural. It was the first thing he needed to do to accept his position. I just wish that I could live in a world without quirks. His gaze drifted down to the bullet wound on his stomach. One villain with a quirk was all it took to almost kill him. Midoriya could have seen him coming from a long way away if he hadn't had a quirk. All for One laughed lightly when he noticed the trail of Midoriya's eyes. What a fitting introduction to his 4th query. Question number 4. Would you like to work for me? He asked, holding up 4 fingers. Midoriya swallowed. This was his opportunity to extract as much information as possible from him. So does that mean that you want me on board with you? He inquired. Certainly. You passed with flying colors, All for One said. And what exactly does this job entail? As she stood close to Midoriya's hospital bed, All for One gestured to her. You will be working closely with me and my young associates. I believe that you have already been introduced to Toga. Midoriya blushed as she turned and gave him a crazy smile. Like you, Midoriya, I wish for a better world too. You see, I have the ability to bestow and take quirks away from any person that I want to. Midoriya let out a gasp. Did they ask him if he wanted a quirk for that reason? Because he could be given quirks by this man, All for One? It was unthinkable to have such power. So that means, yes, All for One anticipated Midoriya's response. I have the ability to make your wish come true. After all, that's what I specialized in doing back when I ruled Japan. What? Was that what he just heard? Midoriya learned in school from his history textbook that there was a man who ruled Japan without question and gave the people quirks. However, the story seemed so unbelievable for what it was that he considered it to be a myth, or at the very least, a tall tale. No way. Midoriya couldn't think of anything to say. Come join me, Izuku Midoriya. Let us create a perfect world together, said All for One. Midoriya considered it for a moment. Wouldn't it be wonderful to live in a world where everyone was as quirkless as he was? It would be pure heaven. No more feeling like a fish out of water would be his burden. No one without a quirk would, in fact. Midoriya, however, could not support him if All for One's claims were accurate and he was indeed the former Japanese ruler. Someone who wished to control others was not someone he wanted to work for. But you said that you used to be the dictator of Japan, right? Replied Midoriya. He interpreted the silence from All for One as affirmation. If that's so, then I can't accept your job offer. I don't want to rule over anyone. I just don't want to have to deal with people with quirks abusing their powers against innocent, quirkless people. At least All Might doesn't do that. All Might, you say? The mention of his name made All for One tense. You must not know his secret, do you? Confused, Midoriya questioned. Huh? What are you talking about? You see, I fought All Might long ago. During our battle we escaped with near-fatal injuries. As you can see, my face is practically gone, and I can only function by using a breathing apparatus. But All Might wasn't much better. I gave him a massive wound in his gut that severely damaged his internal organs. I might have even taken away half of his stomach. But here's the kicker. All for One uncrossed his legs and leaned in until he was sitting on the edge of his chair. All Might was too weak to save you. Midoriya lost the color in her face. Beside him, he heard Toga cackle. What was it that they knew he didn't? What were they trying to say? He heard your cries for help, but unfortunately he had exhausted his powers saving your classmate from the slime villain earlier in the day. The best thing that he could do was take out his cell phone and dial the police and an ambulance for help. And do you want to know the best part? Asked All for One. In view of the distraught look emblazoned on his face, he would, if he could still, smile crookedly at Midoriya. The real reason that he visited you was because he knew that he was ultimately responsible for you being shot. That's a lie. Midoriya yelled loudly while closing his eyes. His fists clenched tightly against his hospital blanket as his body started to tremble. The local anesthetic had therefore worn off. That can't be true. All Might is the #1 hero. He can do anything, it's a fabrication. Not wanting to believe what All for One had told him, the boy quickly shook his head. You can go see for yourself once you've been discharged from the hospital, All for One said, getting up from his chair and snapping his fingers. Two dark portals that looked like wells leading directly to the abyss appeared against the wall. Give careful thought to my offer and what I have said, and keep this in mind. What good is a hero if even the greatest of them, like All Might, was too damaged to save you? All for One entered the portal after saying those final words. Before throwing it on Midoriya's lap, Toga paused to write her number on a notepad. Call me anytime, bad boy, she said, laughing uncontrollably as she waved at him through the second portal. Midoriya was devastated by the villains and buried his face in his hands. Last night, Midoriya hardly got any sleep at all. Everything that had happened the previous evening seemed like a terrible dream. Both All for One and his goons, Toga, who had the quirk of impersonating people, sounded like bad news. But he was unnerved by All for One in particular. For heaven's sake, he was Japan's former dictator. What was his exact age? How did he manage to stay alive so long? Did his quirk cause it? His ungodly ability to steal quirks from other people and pass them on must have been the reason. Particularly if his claims were accurate and he was able to mortally wound All Might to the degree he stated. Nevertheless, Midoriya concealed Toga's phone number, which she had written on a notepad, beneath his pillow despite this knowledge. What the devil was he? Was he truly interested in hanging out with bad guys? Technically speaking, they haven't yet harmed anyone, have they? He pondered. Even though All for One had harmed people in the past, had he changed for the better? They had a very, very negative vibe, but he wasn't positive. He was aware that he could have instantly destroyed the entire hospital if All for One had so desired. However, he decided not to. He was much more intrigued by Midoriya and his notebook of data on the advantages and disadvantages of almost every possible pro-hero. Was that not sufficient proof that he was up to no good? Oh no. What is the reason behind my hesitation to act morally? The decision is clear, however. One person had faith in him. He even extended a job offer to him. Even though Midoriya turned down his offer, the idea is what matters, isn't it? His vision made sense to him. No matter where it came from, it was good to feel validated. Midoriya had had enough of quirk-loving adults constantly deceiving him, using phony platitudes, and telling him that a boy without quirks could become a hero. He was somewhat appreciative of his classmates and even Bakugo for attempting to help him accept his limitations so that he wouldn't endanger himself or embarrass himself in the process. In retrospect, All for One claimed that he had received flying colors in his interview after turning down his offer to acquire a quirk. If he was really up to no good, wouldn't he have killed him and kept his notebook so he could use it to kill or cripple every pro-hero he could? He wanted to offer him a job, but why? That is, what precisely did he want him to do? Examine professional heroes' flaws and relay the findings to him. Did All for One truly think he would act in this way? If he does, then he doesn't know me at all, quieted Midoriya. The door opened and a tall, lanky man wearing a beige buttoned overcoat and a similarly colored top hat entered the room, abruptly interrupting his thoughts. In addition, he had on black slacks, a navy blue tie, an all-white button-up shirt, white gloves, and black dress shoes. He had the appearance of a noir-style comic book detective. The man started to say, "Good morning," taking off his top hat and introducing himself. "My name is Detective Tsukachi and I work with the police force. You mind if I ask you a few questions, Mr. Midoriya?" Midoriya was forced to sigh. He wasn't in the mood to talk or respond to inquiries. Even though his face was still very haggard and exhausted, he made himself smile, albeit weakly. He said, "Sure, no problem," while sitting up in his hospital bed. After saying, "Excellent," the detective pulled up the chair All for One had been sitting in and took a seat himself. "First, I would like to ask you about your condition. Are you doing okay?" When Midoriya started to say, "The doctors haven't made their rounds yet, but I haven't been told any bad news yet. So I guess in this case, no news is good news." "That it is," the investigator concurred. Then, with a more solemn expression, he changed direction. "I'm going to ask you a few questions that may trigger some unpleasant memories of your ordeal, is that okay?" Midoriya gave a head nod. He wanted to cooperate so that the person who shot him could be quickly brought to justice, so he said, "Yes, it's fine." The detective reached into one of his overcoat pockets and took out a pen and a small notebook, saying, "Great. First question is one that I have to ask. Do you have any enemies that you or your family would be aware of?" Midoriya gave a headshake. "No, I'm sure that it was a random incident since he wanted to rob me." "Well, chances were that you could have been targeted and the perpetrator was told to make it look like a robbery," the investigator said. Midoriya was unable to refute the reasoning behind that. "Still, if you don't believe that your family has made any enemies, then I will move on to my next question. Did you manage to get a good look at the perpetrator?" Again, Midoriya shook his head. "No, he wore a black ski mask. He sounded like he was in his mid-30s, and most likely a smoker. He didn't have an accent, but his breath did smell. I never smelt anything like it before." "It was probably alcohol," the investigator stated. "But still, it's amazing that you were able to recall such detailed information in spite of what you've gone through. You may have a future in this line of work." Midoriya gave a sheepish smile. "I'm just doing what I can to help." "Well, regardless, you have a knack for recalling details. Have you considered joining the police academy?" "I have actually," Midoriya said, becoming alert. He could ask the detective anything he wanted to about the program while they were speaking. "If you want we could speak more offline, but as for now I'm on the clock unfortunately," the cop replied. Midoriya gave a nod. "Yes, I'd love to speak with you whenever you're available." The detective gave the boy a smile. "I'm glad to hear it. Now, on to my next question. Did you happen to take a good look at the gun that he used? You don't have to know the model, but just a vague description could help." Midoriya cupped his chin and remarked, "It was a standard issue Beretta M9, maybe an Italian model." The detective fell silent in shock. "You sputtered Midoriya. When Snipe was first starting out as a pro hero he favored that gun before he switched over to his customized weapons." "That he did," the detective stated, taking care to record Midoriya's words. "It's been a pleasure speaking with you," he said, getting up from his chair. "Well, you've given me more than enough valuable information to go off of." "Likewise," Midoriya said with a radiant smile. The tone of his conversation with Detective Tsukachi seemed to have made him much more jovial. The detective gave his card to Midoriya after reaching into his coat pocket. He smiled and said, "I hope to talk to you and see you at the academy someday." Midoriya took the card in his hand and nodded, his eyes sparkling with childlike joy. After donning his top hat, the detective started to head for the door, but he abruptly turned back to face Midoriya. The detective said, "Oh, and one more thing. You seem like a good kid so I don't think that I have to tell you this, but try to keep your nose clean if you do decide to join the academy." "Yes, sir," shouted Midoriya. The doctors made their routine rounds later that morning and, after assessing his vital signs, gave Midoriya the assurance that he might be released in the coming days or so. According to what he was informed, the doctors were able to extract the bullet from his stomach, and fortunately, no serious organ damage was sustained. He might have died from internal bleeding if the bullet had ruptured his spleen, which was only a few inches away. He was allowed to move around the hospital as he pleased because he was still young and in generally good health. His first few steps were difficult after spending the last few days confined to his hospital bed, but eventually he was able to walk normally. That afternoon, his mother came to visit him and gave him some of the schoolwork he had neglected. Fortunately, it was nothing he couldn't manage. There were no ridiculous assignments or essays, but the school year was almost over. He had to worry about entrance and final exams, and he had to make a serious decision about his life's path. His top choice was to enroll in the police academy and train to be a cadet, but the academy was not an easy task. It was a demanding 4-year program similar to UA's Heroes course. Midoriya couldn't possibly make it through it the way he was now. He needed to work out. He could always work for his father if that didn't work out for some reason. However, he disliked the thought of leaving his mother behind and traveling abroad. For years, his father was absent. It was in the summer of a few years ago that he last saw him. It didn't seem likely that he would arrive next summer, but Midoriya's father wasn't prone to being wrong about things like that. He most likely had everything planned out beforehand. Still, he couldn't get rid of the thought that something would happen and make his dad stay abroad for work. That's because it always did something. Unceremoniously, a few days went by before Midoriya was eventually allowed to leave the hospital. He had spent about 4.5 days in the hospital overall, and despite everything that happened during that time, he was grateful for the experience. Midoriya had enough time to get home and get ready for school because he was released from the hospital early in the morning. Midoriya was much too agitated for his mother to encourage him to take the day off. He had no idea what he would do if he were confined for any longer, most likely, scream. He was surprised by how well his classmates treated him on his first day back, and he knew that it wasn't because they felt sorry for him. He appeared to have been well received by them. Hell, he heard some men whispering to his friend that he was tough enough to survive a bullet, so they shouldn't bother him. Not even Bakugo, of all people, bothered him, though it wasn't the typical look of disgust. Midoriya did catch him leering at him a couple of times. To be honest, he had never seen him look at anyone like that before. Is he jealous? For what reason would he feel jealous? Not being shot? The only person who would be jealous of that would be Bakugo. Perhaps he didn't appreciate all of the flattering remarks made about Midoriya. It was more like that. Midoriya left the classroom and the school after the last bell rang and he had collected his things. However, someone at his side abruptly pushed him into a corner before he could escape the campus. "Ah!" Midoriya exclaimed as his back struck the school building's stone wall. He was shocked to learn that Bakugo was the one who had done it. He was obviously upset, which wasn't unusual, but it wasn't how he had been acting earlier in the day. Bakugo yelled at him, "Huh, Deku? Were you acting the entire time?" Huh? Midoriya asked, not understanding his meaning. Why did he feel so angry with him? How did he do it? Bakugo took Midoriya by the collar and exclaimed, "You heard me the first time." He yelled, "I don't understand your question," in response to Midoriya. He became agitated as a result of his confusion. What was wrong with him? Why was he unable to simply leave him alone as he used to? If you were tough enough to survive a bullet, then why did you pretend to be a useless shrimp your entire life? Huh? Midoriya's expression darkened. Is that what this is all about? To get clarification, he had to ask him a question. Do you think that I'm tough, Kachin? Don't call me that, Bakugo grunted as he pushed Midoriya firmly against the wall. Bakugo turned to leave, saying, "Listen, don't go getting any ideas about joining UA. Got it?" However, he made one last statement while doing so. "Someone like you would be more suited to join the police academy." Midoriya's gaze brightened. Did Bakugo simply give him a nod? Although he approached it in a unique manner, Midoriya knew the language he used. Maybe Bakugo thought Midoriya had been acting weak all along. He was unaware, however, that Midoriya's toughness was a result of his imitation of Bakugo. Like him, he was simply too obstinate to give up or pass away. While driving home, Midoriya couldn't help but feel as though he had overlooked something crucial. He was supposed to have spoken to someone about it. No, he thought, not the detective. After he passed his final exams, he intended to talk to him. Then it dawned on him. Literally, he ran into someone because he didn't pay attention to his surroundings. However, this particular individual was so well built that Midoriya collapsed. "Ack!" sputtered the boy. He was startled to see who he had bumped into when he looked up to see exactly what or who it was. "All Might!" cried Midoriya. Saying, "Good afternoon, young Midoriya," All Might gave him a quick smile. "Good afternoon, All Might, sir." Midoriya hurriedly got back up and focused. "I'm sorry I forgot to call you. I know that you wanted to speak with me." All Might laughed arrogantly at Midoriya. "No problem, I just happened to have been in the area and decided to drop by to see if you were home yet. Thankfully I managed to run into you." It was impossible for Midoriya to avoid smiling like a schoolgirl. Here he was, talking to All Might, his idol and hero. How many children would sacrifice themselves to be in his shoes? The boy asked him, "So, to what do I owe the honor?" With a deep exhale, All Might said, "Well, let me cut to the chase." A plume of white smoke filled the room as he did so. Midoriya coughed because it was so thick. But when the smog cleared, he gasped at what he saw. What the All Might he had essentially worshipped his entire life was nothing like the All Might he saw. All Might was extremely thin and weak. Like a bag of bones, he was. He had an angular face and his mouth spit blood when he coughed. What on earth was happening? Before he spoke, All Might cleaned his mouth of blood. "Listen, as you can see, I do not have long left, and I am in need of a successor. So my question to you is this, young Midoriya," All Might said with a scowl. "Would you do me the honor of being my successor?" What? All Might coughed again, or rather, All Might's husk coughed. Even though there was no blood this time, the cough was still painful. The pro-hero repeated, I said, I want you to be my successor. Midoriya looked for a glimmer of doubt, but he couldn't find it. This was a serious matter. All Might was being serious. However, why? Why him? That was nonsensical. Hold on, what did he hear from All for One? The real reason that he visited you was because he knew that he was ultimately responsible for you being shot. Midoriya tightened his jaw. Was that the main purpose of this? Did All Might just feel sorry for him? When the quirkless boy decided to punch Bakugo in the face, he felt the same fire burning in his stomach. Even though he would never consider attacking his idol again, the idea of him being viewed as a charity case still made him angry. Why me? Inquired Midoriya. His voice was low because he already doubted that All Might's request was genuine. All Might paused again to cough and started to say, it would be a shame if a quirkless boy like yourself had his dreams dashed by a dastardly villain. Your mother told me that you wanted to get into UA, right? Well, here's your chance to realize your dream of being a pro-hero? Midoriya was perplexed. Why was he required to apply for the UA by All Might? Of course. He wouldn't have any quirks, and the outcome would still be the same. He would get hurt. I don't understand. Even if you train me, no matter what, I'll still be quirkless. All Might answered, you're wrong there, young Midoriya. I can give you my quirk. Midoriya's shocked eyes grew wide. The true nature of All Might's quirk was the subject of much conjecture. It didn't appear to be a straightforward quirk of reinforcement. He possessed power that had never been seen before. He could jump tall buildings in one bound, he was more powerful than a locomotive, and he was faster than a speeding bullet. If his quirk could be inherited, did that imply that? All Might, were you once quirkless? All Might nodded feebly at him. Yes, that is correct, young Midoriya. I was once a quirkless student in UA, but then my mentor passed on her quirk, One for All, to me. Is it One for All? Midoriya pondered. All for One claimed that he was able to give people quirks and take them away. Did it have anything to do with One for All? But still, that's no reason to make me your successor just because I'm quirkless. There's a lot of quirkless boys that have been injured or hurt by criminals, and there are even some that are deathly ill, so why me? Midoriya asked once more. I already told you that I want to join the police academy and become a cadet. I don't want to be a hero anymore. Young Midoriya, we are more alike than you think, All Might remarked. A vicious scar on his abdomen was visible when he pulled up his shirt. Even after the doctors did their best to suture and stitch his wound, his gut was horribly disfigured. All Might stepped forward to put his hand on Midoriya's shoulder and said, 5 years ago, I was involved in an incident that left me crippled. I had two choices. Either give up being a pro-hero, or keep going. I chose to keep going, and you can too. Besides, the original purpose of One for All was to help make other people's dreams come true. All for One was correct. Midoriya pondered, he made his fist clenched. All Might, Midoriya said in a low, ominous voice. I have a question to ask you, and I want you to give me an honest answer, okay? All Might gave a nod. You have my word that I will tell you the truth, young Midoriya. Then is the only reason that you want me to be your successor is because that you feel guilty for not being able to prevent me from getting shot? The pause was pregnant. The look on All Might's face was dejected, even defeated. Before answering his question, he took as deep a breath as he could. It's true that due to my weakened state, all I could do was call the police, but... Midoriya took a step back and swatted All Might's hand on his shoulder. His expression was vexed as he looked at him. He was simultaneously confused, hurt, and angry. I don't want to inherit the quirk of someone that can't save people. I don't want a quirk at all. Midoriya yelled. His voice trailed off a little, but then he looked up at All Might again and yelled, if even the greatest hero with the greatest quirk in the world can get mortally wounded and become unable to save a life, then what use is a hero at all? All Might looked into Midoriya's eyes and saw a great deal of pain that had mixed with his rage. He was relatable to All of Might. Entering the UA was the worst thing ever. Every day he was reminded that someone without a quirk would not be able to become a pro-hero, and he was repeatedly bullied. He did his best to persevere, just like Midoriya, but he pondered what his life might have been like if a villain like young Midoriya had dashed his hopes. He wouldn't have been strong enough to insist on attending the police academy in order to assist. He was certain of it. He wouldn't be the person he is now if it weren't for Gran Torino and his mentor. Young Midoriya, I understand you, more than you know. You were right, I was there when you got shot, and I am ashamed to admit that I was too weak to save you at the time. However, I can save a life, and I am choosing to save yours by letting you live out your dream. And by proxy, All Might stretched out his arms. This decision could save the lives of countless other people, since you would undoubtedly go on to become a great hero that will save an unheralded amount of civilians. I truly believe that only you possess the strong will and determination to strive to help others even after the police and pro-heroes failed to come to your aid in your hour of need. Midoriya's voice was as soft as a whisper. Stop it. His voice kept rising until he started to yell, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Just stop it!" Was it all for one? Was he viewed as a charity case by All Might? Midoriya initially believed he was correct, but All Might now asserts that he respects his resolve and doesn't. What is it? He was very perplexed. He wished he could avoid having to make this choice. He wishes he didn't have to make a decision. If life would be better. If quirks didn't exist. I don't want a quirk, I don't want any quirks. Why can't we live in a world without quirks? Why do people have to get hurt by other people just because they were born different? You understand that, right, All Might? You said that you were quirkless, so you should understand. You should understand that. Midoriya started to cry, but he wiped them away right away. He had had enough of sobbing. He had had enough of everything. Perhaps he was still troubled by the stress of his traumatic experience. Perhaps it had more of an impact on his choices and behavior than he wanted to acknowledge, but his position was unwavering. You should understand that the world would be better off if there were no quirks at all. All Might said nothing. I don't need a quirk. I don't want a quirk. I'm just tired of being the victim of circumstances that are out of my control, Midoriya stated. He could see All Might's face deteriorate as he spoke. Midoriya felt bad about disappointing the person he most admired, but he had already learned hard lessons from life. He had had enough of fooling himself. I realize now that the only reason I wanted a quirk was so that I could stop being helpless around bullies who had them. I want to help people, and I don't have to go kill myself by going to UA to do that, or worse, becoming a quirkless pro-hero only to die by a thief with a gun. To make his point, he put his hand over the area of his stomach where he had been shot. All Might stood still as Midoriya started to pass. I'm sorry, All Might, but I will not be your successor. Please find someone that is better suited. All Might turned to call to Midoriya as he left. Young Midoriya, if you want to join the police academy, then you will need to be trained first. Why not at least do me the honor of training you? Midoriya came to a complete halt. Then, without turning to face him, he answered All Might. I will be fine, All Might. There have been other quirkless students who managed to train and join the police academy without your help. I should be capable of doing the same. Midoriya walked home after saying her final goodbyes. A deathly pale man declared, I found all the information I could on Hisashi Midoriya, as well as Inko Midoriya. His grayish-blue hair was matted and disheveled, and he kept scratching it, causing flakes to fall out. He had a very disheveled appearance. Through a monitor, All for One said to him, Great job, Tamura. So what did you need information on his parents for? If that Izuku kid that you visited in the hospital refused your offer, then we should have just eliminated him. What if he blabs to the police? Or to All Might? Patience, Tamura, reprimanded All for One. Madness is a lot like gravity. Sometimes all it takes is a little push. Midoriya's days became increasingly structured as the school year came to an end. Every morning before school started, he ran 3 miles. Midoriya insisted on doing so even though his mother wasn't happy about it after he was shot by the criminal known as the Night Stalker, who can blend in with his surroundings and go undetected, according to the news station. If he wanted to pass the police academy's entrance fitness test, he needed to get in shape. His ability to run 3 miles in between 21 and 26 minutes was one of the prerequisites. When the numbers were broken down, he needed to maintain a pace of at least 8.5 minutes per mile. He trained with Detective Tsukachi after school because it was much harder than he had anticipated. The detective explained in detail how the physical fitness test was administered by the police academy. According to what he said, sit-ups were the first exercise that each participant had to complete. Each person would work in pairs, with one person counting while the other completed the exercise. After the scores were totaled, the partners would switch places. Push-ups were the second exercise that the candidates had to complete. The same routine they used for STI-ups would be performed with the same partners. After watching while one counted, they would switch places once more. But each person had only 1.5 minutes to complete as many push-ups and sit-ups as they could because it was a timed event. The final portion of the test was the 3-mile timed run, which came after a short 7-minute break. Detective Tsukachi provided Midoriya with a chart that showed the ages of the participants, the bare minimum of push-ups and sit-ups needed to pass, and the slowest run time that would be necessary for him to pass. According to what he was shown, He needed to complete at least 60 sit-ups in a minute and a half. Additionally, he had to complete a minimum of 50 push-ups in a minute and a half. And it took him 26 minutes to run 3 miles at the slowest pace possible. In his mind, getting those outcomes didn't seem all that hard. He occasionally exercised by himself in his room, performing a few push-ups and sit-ups here and there. But completing it in a limited amount of time was a completely different matter. Furthermore, if he wanted to rest or catch his breath during his push-ups, he had to stay in the up position. He became aware of how weak his upper body strength was overall at that point. His arms went mushy when he kept them in the up position for even 10 seconds between sets. He could only complete 40 sit-ups and 35 push-ups in a minute and a half when he first started. He struggled with self-pacing and misjudged how hard it would be to complete the exercises in the allotted time. Additionally, his running time was ridiculously poor. Initially, he could only complete 3 miles in 35 minutes. But Detective Tsukachi was able to provide him with some helpful hints to get him started. For example, performing 10-second spurts and resting for 5 seconds in between. He was better able to pace himself in this way. Detective Tsukachi was, to put it mildly, proud of the outcomes, which worked wonders for him. With only his own diligence, willpower, and determination, Midoriya had made great strides. The detective pulled out his phone and showed Midoriya a photo of himself after they had run 3 miles together. The detective said, "Look, this was you several months ago." Midoriya was sprawled on the ground in a cold sweat in the photo. He had his mouth open and his arms and legs spread wide. It seemed like he was completely gassed. The detective gave the eccentric boy a pat on the back and grinned, saying, "You were this exhausted after only running a mile and a half. Now look at you, you can practically keep up with me." Midoriya started to cry. "I'm so thankful for you. It's strange, I feel blessed, you know? In spite of everything that I've been through, I still feel blessed." The detective said, "Make no mistake, Midoriya," as he raised his gaze to the sky. "In this world, we make our own blessings." Only a week remained until the police academy entrance exam. Additionally, Midoriya had more free time than he could manage because school was out for the summer. He devoted most of his time to doing his best to assist his mother. But lately, his mother had been a little unkempt. Midoriya wanted to push the issue, but he was afraid that doing so would spark an argument. She appeared to be stressed about something, but every time he tried to ask her what was wrong, his mother would dismiss it and tell him it was nothing. His mother asked him, "Izuku honey, what would you like for dinner?" "How about some katsudon?" he asked dignifiedly. Midoriya came into the kitchen to find his mother frantically going through the refrigerator and kitchen cabinets. She seemed to have looked unwell once more. He looked at her and scowled. Did he ask her too many questions? "Mom," Midoriya started to utter, "it's okay if you don't have the ingredients for it." His mother was still scurrying around when Midoriya came up to her and placed his hand on her shoulder. "But I know that it's your favorite honey," he said. "Mom," he uttered firmly. She was shaken by his voice. "I said it's okay." After a moment of looking down with a sunken face, she inhaled deeply to regain her composure. After arranging her apron and hair, she turned to face her son and uttered, "How about soba and udon?" Midoriya nodded and grinned at her. "That'll be just fine." His mother made 2 bowls, one for him and one for herself, in less than an hour. His mother seemed to have a lot on her mind already, so he had set the table for them to ease her burden, but for the moment, she seemed to be in a good mood. They ate in relative silence after exchanging pleasantries until Inko's phone vibrated in her pocket. She said to him, "I'm sorry honey, do you mind if I check this?" He replied, Sure, of course it's fine," to her. She asked for his permission first, which he thought was strange. His mother's expression changed to one of obvious distress as she checked her phone. She had just received a message, and it was clear that it was bad news. Midoriya said, "Mom, are you okay?" Inko said, quickly returning her phone to her pocket. Her smile was forced. "It's fine," she said. Midoriya sighed in frustration. His mother wasn't being cooperative at all, which worried him and made him want to find out what was causing her stress. He would probably need to do some research. "May I be excused?" he said abruptly as he rose from his seat. "But you didn't finish the rest of your food. I'll have it for lunch tomorrow." Inko looked like he had fallen. She did not want her son to be overly stressed by her concerns. She felt as though everything was crumbling, despite her best efforts to keep it together. "Okay dear, I'll save it for you. Thank you Mom. Good night," Midoriya said as he made his way to his room and shut the door. After several hours, Midoriya was still awake. After all, he hadn't intended to sleep. It was midnight when he looked at the time on his phone. Excellent. By then, his mother was always asleep. Silently, he opened the door to his bedroom and slipped out. When he reached the door to his mother's bedroom, he opened it just enough to get a glimpse inside. His mother was asleep, just as he had assumed. Sneaking into her room, he went to her nightstand, where her phone was. He picked it up gingerly and switched the phone on. After entering his birthday's numbers on the passcode screen, he was able to access her phone. "Mom, you really need to think of a better passcode," Midoriya pondered. He was astounded by what he saw when he opened her messages. For the previous 6 months, his mother had been unsuccessfully attempting to contact and message his father. Additionally, there were no read receipts, indicating that this father never looked at her messages. Earlier that morning, his mother sent his father the following final message. "I just used the last of the emergency funds for the mortgage, but I'm still behind on the electric bill, as well as the phone bill. Please honey, I don't know what's going on, but please answer me. Please. We need you. Our son needs you. I don't know how long we can keep this up." What's happening? Neither he nor his mother were ever neglected by his father. You could reach him by phone or text message at any time. He seemed to have simply vanished. After that, Midoriya clicked on the message his mother had received at dinner and backed out of the conversation between his father and mother. He was horrified to learn that the money his mother had sent to cover the mortgage had been turned down. Additionally, it stated that all residents would be evicted within a week due to the fraudulent nature of the funds used. Midoriya was devastated, so he discreetly returned his mother's phone to the nightstand before leaving her room, making sure to silently shut the door behind him. Returning to his room, he lay down in utter anguish. How could he proceed? Were they going to do something? He had to take the physical fitness test in a week in order to be admitted to the cadet academy. However, he was unable to concentrate on that while he and his mother were being removed from their house. What was his dad doing, anyway? He was ignoring his mother. Why? What justification might he have? He has no justification, Midoriya pondered. How long it would take him to forgive his father for this was unknown to him. That is, if he ever could. In search of a solution, Midoriya searched beneath his pillow and discovered a notepad he had kept with a number on it. He had no choice at this moment, but he never thought he would ever use it. The number only needed to ring once before someone answered when he dialed it. Toga exclaimed, "Hello bad boy, I just knew that you'd call," with enthusiasm. Midoriya shook his head and asked, "How did you know that this was my num?" There were more pressing issues for him to worry about. "Is that job offer still open?" Toga gave Midoriya an address and instructed him to arrive there within 15 minutes. When he got there, he was instructed to give her a call. He was still anxious, but those instructions seemed easy enough to follow. He didn't want to harm anyone or rob innocent people to obtain the money, but he needed it immediately. All for One needed to know that the oddball boy wasn't there to stir things up. He was desperate for an honest job. However, he knew in his heart that there was little chance that his work would be anything other than dishonest. It took him no more than 10 minutes to walk from his house to the specified coordinates. The site he was assigned was the exterior of an abandoned warehouse, which he occasionally passed on his way home from school. He pulled out his phone and called the number Toga had provided him again. "Hello, this is Izuku, I'm here." Quiet. Then, from behind him, he heard her whispering voice. "I just knew that you'd come." Midoriya almost burst out laughing. His face was plastered with shock as he turned to look at her. How on earth did she end up supporting him? He stammered, "Where did you come from?" With an uncontrollable cackle, Toga gestured toward an alleyway next to the warehouse. "I warped here, silly," she said with a smile of amusement. "Warped?" exclaimed Midoriya, puzzled. Did she have a quirk like that? Then she leaned into Midoriya and abruptly took his hand. He could feel her breath tickle his neck as her mouth was near his ear. In an attempt to relax, the oddball boy tried to turn his head away as his face flushed. "Too near. Hang on tight." Midoriya felt a sickening impulse to throw up before he had had time to absorb what she had said. He spit out a charcoal-black liquid that smelled even worse than it appeared when he opened his mouth. Despite his best efforts to resist, the liquid started to envelop his entire body. Then everything went dark the next thing he knew. When Midoriya reached the spot where he had been twisted, he was on his knees, coughing. He felt as though his lungs were on fire, despite his best efforts to catch his breath. What was that peculiarity? Such a quirk had never been seen or heard of before, even by him. "Ah, you'll get used to it," Toga said as she patted his back in a manner similar to a mother's. Upon regaining his composure, he looked up to find a whole group of people staring at him, possibly trying to determine whether he was an enemy or a friend. The bar stool was occupied by one of them. He had what looked like old, rotten, and shabby skin. Moreover, it is flaky. His light blue hair was unkempt, and a hand that Midoriya could only surmise was that of a mannequin covered his face. He looked unhappy, and only his left eye was visible. He said, "Welcome, Izuku Midoriya, is it?" To a man. Maybe it was a bit too nice to call him a man. Despite his hideous appearance and bright yellow eyes, he was dressed in a suit that resembled that of a butler. "Why yes," said Midoriya in a faltering voice. One of the men, wearing a dark costume and a mask over his face, stood to the side of the room. At first, his expression seemed uninterested, but it abruptly changed to one of hospitality when he turned to face Midoriya. The man said, "Welcome, welcome, make yourself at home," with a kind voice. "Or not, I don't care," the man added, his voice much more level. All Midoriya did was blink. He was unable to determine if the man was genuinely crazy or not. As though he had not heard the outburst, the grotesque man went on talking. It's possible that the other man's esoteric behaviors were normal. "Ah, we have been expecting," he started to say, "why do you want this job?" but was interrupted by the man with the unkempt blue hair. "Midoriya," he narrowed his eyes. Midoriya was aware that he had no justification for lying. He needed to be as open as possible. "I'm desperate," Midoriya started, his fists clenched. "I am in desperate need of money. My mom can't afford to pay the bills anymore, and if I don't come up with enough money by next week then we will be put out." The man got up from his bar stool and started to flex his wrist, asking, "So what you're saying is that you plan on ditching us after you get what you want?" Midoriya started to feel anxious, but he wasn't sure why. He got chills from the murderous vibe emanating from the man in front of him. He was seriously endangered. His entire life would end in an instant if he failed to provide a satisfactory response. He sensed it. As he struggled to think of a suitable response, sweat trickled down his chin, but the spectral man behind the bar stepped forward to defend Midoriya. "Wait, Tamura. You are being too harsh. He said that he's here to work," and All for One said. Tamura turned and glared at the man as if he were dead. "What I am saying is, how can we trust the half-assed loyalty of some brat, Kurogiri?" Tamura asked, returning his focus to Midoriya, who was still drenched in sweat. He moved closer to Midoriya, who retreated a step. "What's to say that he won't run his mouth about us after the job? What if he tells All Might? I don't trust him," he said. Tamura opened his gloved hand and started to reach out to the boy without a quirk, asking, "Do you want to know what my quirk does, Izuku?" His smile was devilish. "When all 5 fingers of my hands touch something, or someone," he said, "they disappear." Immediately, Midoriya bowed his head and fell to his knees. All he could do was this. He had to plead for his life, he had to beg. "Please. Let me do this job and I'll be indebted to you, I'll do whatever you want," Midoriya pleaded. "I can't trust the word of someone whose dream is to join the police academy," replied Tamura. The back of Midoriya's head was getting closer and closer to Tamura's hand. The oddball boy kept his head buried in the bar's wooden floor, even though he could feel Tamura's hand hovering over him. He gritted his teeth and felt his body tremble with anxiety. Kurogiri shouted, "Tamura," at him. "Don't hurt him," yelled the man in the mask. He shouted, "Turn him to ash," as well. Toga, however, wheeled a television set onto the back of the bar, diverting their focus. All for One himself appeared on the TV screen. "That is quite enough, Tamura," All for One remarked, pressing his cheek to his fist. Tamura laughed. He was literally on the verge of reducing the boy to dust. With a sigh, he returned to his stool and sat down again. His face was a picture of boredom. All for One was displayed on the screen when Midoriya looked up, but he was not wearing his mask. His eyes and hair were not visible, but everything from his nose down was. Even so, Midoriya couldn't help but notice that, for someone who had claimed to have lived for more than a century, he looked remarkably young. All for One questioned, "Is what you are saying true, Izuku? About you and your mother?" Midoriya gave a nod. "According to All for One, then consider your problem solved." It broke Midoriya's heart. What do you mean?" "Your job will be a simple one. Deliver a briefcase to one of my other associates. In turn, she will hand you a briefcase filled with cash. $100,000. You may use that money to take care of any and all expenses that you and your mother have." Midoriya's emotions overcame her. He wiped away the tears that started to well up in his eyes as fast as he could. "Thank you, All for One. Thank you so much." Midoriya's work was easy and uncomplicated. A dark black briefcase containing a product he was not permitted to know was in his hand. At an exchange point, Located on the upper level of a hotel parking garage, he had to meet with one of All for One's associates. Midoriya had been waiting for All for One's associate to show up to this point, but they had been running late, whoever they were. Would tardiness be one of the issues that prompted him to call them if he encountered any problems? What if Midoriya was being used as bait and this whole thing was a setup, as a lamb sacrificed? But the thought was quickly dashed from his mind. In addition to offering him a job and supporting him and his family, All for One was prepared to come clean with him. He went to all that trouble to set him up, but why? There would be no sense in it. The oddball boy sighed as he glanced at his watch. There is still no sign of anyone after 30 minutes. A woman's voice crooned, "Oh, you must be new to the gang." Midoriya spun around, almost leaping out of his skin. A school-age girl with short blonde hair and an eye patch over her left eye greeted him with a smile. She smiled sweetly at Midoriya and crowded his personal space, causing his face to flush red with shame. Why yes. He nodded anxiously at her. He wasn't sure if he should use his real name or a fictitious one. Well, forget about that. It would be disastrous to reveal his true name. Saying, "I'm Deku," the first name that sprang to mind was that one. He was on the verge of hitting himself. Out of all the various names and aliases he could think of, the only one he could think of was one that his childhood bully had created for him. The girl clutched her stomach as she burst out laughing. She wiped a tear from her eye and composed herself after a brief moment. She remarked, "Deku, huh? That's pretty funny." Then she extended a hand to tousle Midoriya's hair. She said, "You're cute, what a shame," with a sulky tone. What she was referring to baffled Midoriya. Was she implying that it was unfortunate he had to engage in illegal means to make ends meet? If that is the case, she was not alone in feeling that way. He never in a million years imagined that he would have to turn to put it mildly, less than respectable activities. But there was nothing else he could do. His dad wasn't helping, and his mom was under a lot of stress. He needed to take charge. He needed to take action. Presented the briefcase, Midoriya said. The girl snapped her fingers and smiled slyly. Immediately, 6 of her thugs emerged from behind the parking lot's pillars. Did they stay the whole time? Why hadn't he noticed them? How was he unable to see them? What Midoriya thought was the payment was in a silver briefcase that one of her friends was carrying. The girl, who was his boss, received the briefcase from the big, burly man in the black suit. He then gave it to Midoriya, who then gave it to him. Then Midoriya grinned as he glanced up at her. "Pleasure doing business with you, miss," she said. Queen B, first." Then she stepped forward to whisper in his ear, "But you can call me Queen." She stepped back and patted the briefcase while grinning down at it. "Do you know what's in here, Deku?" she said to him. Midoriya gave a headshake. "It's a drug that can boost the strength and effectiveness of someone's quirk at the cost of their sanity," she said. Midoriya swallowed. That sounded unpleasant to him. Now he was involved in drug trafficking. Should he be apprehended, then? As the worst happened, sirens suddenly sounded all over the parking garage. They were caught by the police. Queen's goons prepared their weapons as she called forth a swarm of bees from her eye patch. She turned to face Midoriya, who clutched his silver briefcase to his chest and started to cower in terror. She spat at him, saying, "What's the matter with you? Use your quirk." Her abrupt change in tone surprised Midoriya. She used to seem pleasant, almost vivacious. She was different now, though. As the police started to encircle them in their patrol cars, her face was contorted with anger. To her, Midoriya yelled, "I don't have one," loudly enough to be heard over the sirens. With a sneer, Queen Bee gestured for one of her thugs to throw a gun at Midoriya. Still trembling, he dropped the briefcase and caught it. Prior to enrolling in the police academy, he had no idea that he would ever need to shoot a gun. However, he was now going to take part in a shootout with the police. "We have you surrounded," a police officer shouted, pointing his firearm at the group of troublemakers. He followed suit with his partners, hiding behind their police cars so that only their faces, arms, hands, and firearms were visible. Midoriya's gaze widened. He knew the policeman. Detective Tsukachi was the one. But the boy turned away quickly, so it appeared that the detective had missed him. "Surrender or we will be forced to use lethal force." With a toothy grin, Queen gave the order for her bees to attack. As her thugs started shooting randomly, they gathered around the police to divert their attention. Midoriya sought cover behind one of the parking garage's pillars so she wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. In that instant, all he could think about was the choices he had made that had brought him to this particular moment. In theory, all of this occurred as a result of his shooting, correct? Because he would not have met All for One, been in the hospital, or received this job offer if he had never been shot. Better yet, maybe his dad was to blame for his family's impending eviction by failing to answer his mother's questions. Hell, perhaps he wouldn't have been shot in the first place if he had a quirk. He could spend all day going around in circles, but he had to make a choice now. He heard Queen Bee exclaim, "Ah," in agony. When he looked around the corner, he saw that she had been shot by the police and that blood was dripping from her eye. Midoriya gulped as he glanced down at his briefcase and gun. For his mother, he would put everything on the line. No inquiries were made. Without hesitation, he would put his life and future in danger. He had done everything he had done for her up until this point. Whether or not his father was involved, he was now in a position to care for her for the rest of her life. It had to be done by Midoriya. With his gun in hand, he hurried out from behind the pillar. He had witnessed snipes shooting a dozen times. How difficult could it be? Queen was seized and pulled to safety behind one of the pillars by the eccentric boy who had turned criminal. The detective instantly yelled for his men to cease firing when he saw his protege, Midoriya, dash out from behind the pillar. "Stop firing. Stop," mandated the detective. What the devil was happening here? From where did Midoriya originate? Were they holding him captive? Was it against his will that he had to work with them? And he could think of no other plausible explanation. The detective put his hand on the officer's arm as one of the officers prepared to fire another shot. The detective yelled, "Don't fire. They have a school student with them." In an attempt to frighten one of the policemen, Midoriya tried to shoot back, but the recoil made him miss. He heard his bullet bounce off the parking garage's roof. The detective initially scowled at Midoriya's behavior before realizing that the oddball boy was probably being used or held captive. Tsukachi was certain that Izuku wouldn't want to harm a fly, much less a police officer, but he couldn't say how or why. He therefore reasoned that in order to avoid being executed immediately for leading the police to them, he needed to give the impression that he was doing something. The detective commanded, "Take out the goons but don't shoot at the boy. He's on our side." Midoriya attended to Queen Bee and gave her the silver briefcase containing the payment while her thugs carried on the firefight. Midoriya started to say, "Please, I have a favor to ask of you," while wiping the blood from her eye with his shirt. "I took this job because I needed the money for my mother. My dad works abroad and he suddenly stopped responding to her calls. Now we are on the verge of eviction, but this briefcase had enough money in it to ensure that she will never have to worry about it ever again." Queen was forced to observe his word choice. Enough money to ensure that she will never have to worry about it? Midoriya smiled half-heartedly and nodded. "Yes, I'm going to take the fall for you. I will create a diversion while you escape," Midoriya replied. Queen raised an eyebrow. "And how will you do that?" Midoriya handed her his firearm. "Take me hostage, I will pretend as if you put me up to it. When I shot at them, I missed completely. One of the cops out there is my mentor, Detective Tsukachi. Right now he's probably thinking that I missed on purpose, or that the only reason I fired the shot was to make it look like I was on your side so that you and your goons wouldn't kill me," Midoriya started saying. Queen Bin's eyes widened in surprise, and Midoriya smiled sheepishly at her. His words were, It's a long story, but he trusts me, and we can use that against him." Taking the gun, Queen Bee pressed it to the boy's head. She remarked, "I like the way you think. It's a shame that I had orders to betray you, but it's funny how things work out in the end." "Huh?" One of Queen Bee's friends caught the silver briefcase in midair after she threw it across the parking garage. Then she threw the black briefcase to another of her thugs, who also took it. "Okay, showtime," the crime boss exclaimed, grinning like a fiend. With her gun aimed at Midoriya's head and her arm around his neck, she emerged from behind the pillar. The detective Tsukachi commanded, "Stop shooting," and the gunfire on both sides ceased as he ordered. Queen Bee started to say, "Let's talk," as she moved forward. Darkly, the detective asked, "What do you want?" "One of your cars to go please," she said rather sweetly. Her request was not taken seriously by the detective, who gave her a non-committal look. Midoriya took advantage of the moment to tap Queen's thigh with his free hand that was at his side. She was drawn to this, and as she glanced down at him, she noticed him gesturing to his arm. His signal was initially unclear to her, but she soon figured out what he was trying to say. She started to say, "We know how much this boy means to you, detective," before shooting Midoriya in the arm. When the boy screamed in excruciating pain, several police officers retaliated by pointing their weapons at her. But Queen Bee waved her finger at them and aimed her gun back at the strange boy's head. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. I can decorate this garage with this boy's brains before any of you can get to me. Would you want that on your conscience? With a clenched fist, the detective motioned for the rest of his officers to get down. Then he signaled his partners to make room for Queen Bee and her henchmen to approach one of their patrol cars. Nevertheless, Midoriya saw that the detective signaled for another officer to fire. It appeared that he would actually have to out himself, even though he had already planned to divert their attention. Even though he was in a lot of pain from the gunshot wound he was holding onto, he believed he could still warn her and her thugs to leave Dodge. Midoriya broke free from Queen Bee's hold and pushed her with his shoulder in the direction of the car as soon as she turned away. He yelled, "Move! Get out of here," as the officer who was meant to make the shot completely missed. Queen hurriedly climbed into the driver's seat, and her thugs loaded the 2 briefcases into the car. Midoriya stood in front of them with his arms outstretched when the detective gave the order to start shooting. She had enough time to drive away from danger thanks to this maneuver. Tsukachi, the detective, squinted at Midoriya. He said, "What are you doing?" to him. He was training with Midoriya just the other day. The boy was excited to serve and protect defenseless civilians by enrolling in the police academy. However, he was now defending wanted criminals who were dumping drugs on the streets. There was no sense in it. How could things have changed so quickly? Midoriya was unwavering. He was limited to mouthing the words, "I'm sorry." The detective, frustrated, signaled one of the officers to handcuff Midoriya. Subsequently, Midoriya heard 6 words that he never would have imagined hearing. "Izuku Midoriya, you are under arrest, in handcuffs." In the rear of a police vehicle, en route to the police headquarters. He would have been extremely anxious if he had been informed even a week prior that he would be in this predicament and that it was unavoidable. He would go into a panic, withdraw into himself, and most likely try his hardest to avoid trouble in order to prevent it from happening. But here he was, in handcuffs, in the rear of a police vehicle. En route to the police headquarters, he was also content with himself. Why? For however long he was in the juvenile detention facility before serving his prison term, at least he was certain that his mother would be cared for. Even though his father didn't step up, he was still able to do it. There was nothing he could do. In a sense, he had to pull the trigger. For the most part, the ride to the station went smoothly. He remained silent even though Detective Tsukachi was the one who was driving him. Maybe he wanted to save all of his inquiries for the questioning. Certainly standard procedure. Hold on, didn't he have a right to a call? What did his mother say? How would she perceive it? How would she respond? In all of this, he never once took her feelings into account. Could she tolerate her child's criminal behavior? The embarrassment? The shame of having brought him up? The isolation? Perhaps his choice was a mistake after all? He shook his head hastily. No, the alternative was being evicted from his mother's house and being left without a place to live. He was certain that his decision was the right one. He opted for the less severe option. In addition, he would be able to predict his mother's response more accurately when the time came to call her. The 2 police escorts on either side of Midoriya helped him exit the vehicle at the station. Even wearing handcuffs while walking felt improper. They made him feel heavy and burdened him. It was also a little awkward to have his hands tied behind his back. He was handed over to one of the officers inside the police station after being led through the doors. After releasing Midoriya's handcuffs, the officer led him to a room where a phone was mounted on the wall. 1 phone call, 5 minutes was the officer's only statement. As soon as he picked up the phone, Midoriya called his mother. A few times it rang, and then a few more. She picked up at last. Her voice called out to him, "Hello?" Midoriya swallowed. His knees gave way. His chest constricted. He had underestimated how difficult this would be. The words, "Hi Mom, it's me," faded from Midoriya's voice. "Izuku honey," said his mother. The relief he heard would normally be a good thing. Unfortunately, though, it wasn't this time. Tears filled his eyes because he was going to break his mother's heart. "I'm glad that you're okay. I looked everywhere for you. I even called the police. Where are you?" "Mom, I'm sorry," he started telling her. "I'm so sorry, I had to do it. I did it for you, for us." "What's wrong? What are you saying, honey?" she asked. She had absolutely no idea what to do. What was he discussing? Midoriya started to say, "I know about what's been going on," in a whispery voice. "I looked through your phone Mom, but it's okay, I took care of it." "Okay. I took care of it. But I had to do something really bad." Before his mother spoke again, there was a momentary silence on the other end. She seemed to be hyperventilating because her breaths were labored and ragged. What do you mean dear? Izuku please don't tell me." He let a tear fall down his cheek. Yes, this would be much more difficult than he had anticipated. He tried to steady himself by clenching his fists as his body started to tremble. He had to be honest with her. It was now or never, and he didn't have much time to talk. I took a job, a bad job. I am at the police station for getting caught. I've been arrested, Mom. On the phone, his mother broke down in uncontrollable tears. His heart was broken. At that moment, he nearly wanted to cry with her. But he heard the dial tone on the other end before he could say another word. After saying, "Your time is up," the officer stepped forward and reattached the cord phone to the receiver. To get himself straight, Midoriya wiped the tears from his eyes and shook his head. When he was led to the interrogation room, he turned to face the policeman. The officer indicated that Midoriya should sit down in a chair there. With a gulp, the boy took a seat, and the officer left the room, closing the door behind him. With a groan, Midoriya laid his head on the table. He had actually succeeded. His future was over after he made the decision to take the fall for criminals. Completed. When he reached adulthood, he would spend a considerable amount of time in prison after spending time in a juvenile detention facility. He began to doubt everything he had done after hearing his mother sobbing. All he wanted to do was assist as best he could. I wish he hadn't been apprehended. I wish he had been able to get away with the money. No, isn't that how criminals think? They hold other people accountable for their choices, correct? What other option did he have, though? What choices did he have? Request a few $1,000s from the police to find him. Midoriya's head shot upwards as the door opened abruptly. Detective Tsukachi entered with a disgruntled expression on his face. In front of his protege, well, his ex-protege turned criminal, he pulled up a chair and sat down. A pause occurred. They looked at one another. There was no verbal communication. The detective finally said something. His voice was pained as he asked, "Why?" Midoriya's eyes went down. "I had to," was his reply. Leaning closer, the detective glared at the oddball boy. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he inquired. Although it was a rhetorical question, he was unaware that Midoriya was aware of the contents of the briefcase. He believed that he went in blind for the money after taking the job from someone else. "You allowed a crime lord that is flooding the city with a dangerous drug to escape police custody," he yelled. Midoriya winced. Detective Tsukachi had raised his voice, something he had never heard before. Midoriya had yet to defend himself to the detective. And for what? Why would you willingly commit a crime like that? Midoriya started to say, "I needed the money," in a whispery voice. "My dad sends money from overseas to my mom to pay the bills, but one day he suddenly stopped responding. We were going to be evicted in a week. I had to do something." Detective Tsukachi angrily responded, "You had to commit a crime. Why didn't you come to me, Izuku? Why didn't you let me help you?" Midoriya tightened his jaw. He retaliated, "And how could you have helped? Were you going to spot me a few $1,000s?" With a frustrated sigh, the detective said, "It's called a loan, Izuku. I could have pulled some strings and gotten your mother a loan. Or I could have asked the academy to help cover you and your mother. Do you really think that we would let one of our future cadets get evicted? We could have helped you. I could have helped you." Midoriya covered the gunshot wound on his abdomen with his hand. "You mean like how you helped me from getting shot?" Midoriya's statement stunned his mentor, and his words lingered in the air. He instantly felt bad about what he had said, and Midoriya's face changed to one of regret. Midoriya opened his mouth to say, but the detective interrupted. "If someone dies because of your decision to allow a criminal to peddle more drugs onto the streets, then that's different, right? Because that's on you," he said. Detective Tsukachi paused to catch his breath. "But if you would have died in that shootout," he said. He felt uneasy just picturing the situation in his mind. "Then that would have been on me." When the consequences of his choice finally hit him, Midoriya's eyes started to well up with tears. What could have made him so foolish? He had other choices, but he blew them. Since the police had let him down once, he didn't think about asking them for assistance. For heaven's sake. His mentor was the chief detective of the police department. He was connected. He had the ability to pull strings. Why hadn't he considered that earlier? "I'm sorry." When the detective said, "Sorry doesn't cut it." "Please," Midoriya said as tears started to fall down her cheeks. "Please, I didn't know that you could have helped me. I just wanted to help my mom, please all." "Here's what you're facing," the detective started. "Drug trafficking, that's 10 years to life. Conspiracy to sell an uncontrolled substance. That's another 10 years to life." Then Midoriya started to shake his head. "No. This isn't possible." He got up from his chair and turned to leave the room, saying, "You've made your bed, Izuku. I told you before, didn't I? In this world we make our own blessings. The same is true for our misfortunes. This is out of my hands. Midoriya yelled, "Please," to him. "Please, there has to be something that I can do." The investigator unlocked the door. "Please." Midoriya was left alone when the detective entered the room and slammed the door behind him. Midoriya was by herself. He felt physically isolated and as though he had no one to lean on. Well, his mother was still out of the picture. What was the duration? 4 or 5 hours, maybe? He could tell it was getting close to midnight because he watched the policemen start switching shifts again. He would occasionally overhear them inquire about his case and his actions, and they would conclude by shaking their heads and stating, "What a waste." In his hands, Midoriya buried his face. He was useless. He appeared to have caught the attention of one of the policemen. She was a tall, hourglass-shaped, blonde woman with long, flowing hair. Unfortunately, she was a police officer, even though she didn't look like one. She would glare at him with daggers whenever she walked by his holding cell. His skin would always crawl under her cold glare. Finally, when she was certain no one was watching, she went back to the cell and gave the boy a devilish smile. She cooed, "Hey there," to him. Midoriya gave her a nervous response after looking up at her. "Hi," he said. He spoke in a low, unenthusiastic voice. He asked her as she started to unbutton her uniform, "You hungry?" The female officer unbuttoned just below Midoriya's cleavage and reached into her bra to retrieve a pre-made sandwich wrapped in plastic, causing her cheeks to flush. Then she threw it to him, reaching her arm through the opening in the bars. The boy picked up the sandwich and gulped. The feel of it was warm. She had this in her bra. The officer gestured for him to bite into her uniform before buttoning it back up. Midoriya briefly pondered what the other officers were focused on that kept them diverted for so long. He soon discovered, however, that this was indeed the skeleton crew. Therefore, they were most likely unwinding in the office or perhaps even dozing off. The oddball boy heard the female officer laugh uncontrollably as he took a bite out of the sandwich after removing the plastic wrapper. With a devilish smile, she asked him, "How does it taste?" Her eyes were piercing and sharp, and Midoriya shrank beneath them. "It tastes good," he said in a tremulous voice to her. He didn't particularly enjoy the egg sandwich, but he was so hungry that he would eat anything. The officer's smile widened even more after he finished his sandwich. She grabbed a key from her belt and inserted it into the keyhole of the hold cell. Instinctively, Midoriya scooted back against the wall until he was unable to do so any longer when she opened the cell door. The female officer started to say, "Don't worry," as she walked confidently in his direction and shut the cell door behind her. "I won't hurt you, bad boy." When Midoriya squatted down eye level with him, her eyes widened. "That's what only one other person called him. TT Toga," he cried out. She gave him a broad, toothy smile, flashing her unusually sharp canine teeth as her hand lightly stroked his cheek. As her actual form became apparent to him, her body started to practically melt. "It's me, Izuku, in the flesh," she said. He was always in awe of how believable her disguises were. It was nearly impossible to ever suspect her because of how drastically different she was in every way, from height to shape to even the inflection of her voice. But doing so would require a thorough investigation into the person she was posing as. He sputtered, What are you doing here? This wasn't good, but what if they were discovered?" She said, "I came here for you, silly," while perched on his lap. Midoriya heard a male officer's heart-stopping scream. Midoriya sputtered, What was that?" But Toga put both hands on his face and looked him in the eyes. Midoriya heard another heart-stopping cry. "It's a beautiful sound, right?" she asked herself. He wished he could see what was happening, but Toga made himself keep his eyes on her. "Right?" she said, leaning closer. Her warm breath tickled his nostrils. She rubbed her thumb against the oddball boy's bottom lip, sending shivers down his spine as her breathing intensified. His expression was a twisted mixture of horror at the men and women of the Boys in Blue's ongoing dying cries and surprise at Toga's touch. He could hear Detective Tsukachi, his former mentor, trying to radio for backup from the adjacent room. "This is Detective Tsukachi, requesting immediate." Midoriya's eyes widened in surprise. No, he wished him not to perish. He wished for none of them to perish. Why was this taking place? Why was this necessary? A scream was heard, followed by silence. Paradoxically, the sound that reverberated the loudest was silence. The person who had been training him for the past few months in order to get into the police academy, his mentor, was deceased. And he was solely to blame. Midoriya's face became expressionless, and his eyes, which had previously gleamed with youthful joy and hope, took on a somber and listless undertone. In front of Toga's eyes, His irises had darkened. Am I in hell? He pondered. Cooing to him, Toga said, that's a nice expression. She was aware of how much the detective meant to him, and it was pure joy to see the anguish on his face after hearing his mentor's final words. Even as her breathing became frantic, she kept his face close to hers. This wasn't good. She had so many things she wanted to do to him. She was unable to contain herself any longer. Her forehead touched his as her face leaned ever so slightly in. Initially appearing to ignore her, Midoriya's head tilted slightly upward, indicating that he had recognized her presence. A shadowy figure appeared, and smoke started to fill the area. He called out to Toga and Midoriya, and blue flames flickered around him. He could not tell for certain, but it seemed to him that the two were lip-locking. In a casual, deadpan tone, he asked, "Are you two lovebirds finished?" Toga puffed out her cheeks in a pout as she turned to face Dabi. She complained, we were just getting to the best part too," as she got to her feet and extended her hand to Midoriya. She said to him, "Come on bad boy, let's go." Midoriya remained motionless and unresponsive for a moment. But as he took her hand in his and got to his feet, his vacant eyes were fixed on Toga. However, his expression was unreadable due to his cocked head. Dabi questioned, "What's the matter with him?" "Oh nothing, he's just been through a lot," she said, turning to give him a sensual cheek rub. "Isn't that right?" Midoriya remained silent. Twice, Dabi emerged from behind, his tape measure fastened to his wrists. "Please, step aside Toga. Move out of the way." He said both things almost at the same time. Toga moved aside without objecting, enabling Twice to swiftly take Midoriya's entire body measurements. He later succeeded in creating a clone of Midoriya that was identical to him in terms of appearance and size. Midoriya still showed no signs of surprise, astonishment, or emotion in spite of this. A ball of raging blue flame was conjured by Dabi, and it engulfed the clone entirely until only cinders and ash remained. After finishing that, he looked at Twice, Toga, and Midoriya. "I'll finish things up here before more cops arrive," he said. With a nod, Toga took Midoriya's hand and led her out of the cell and toward the exit. Twice trailed closely in their wake. Queen, also known as Queen Bee, drove a stolen police car that they used for their escape. Queen noticed Midoriya's expressionless face once they were inside. She questioned, "What's the matter with him?" Leaning her head against Midoriya's shoulder, Toga put her arms around his arm. She said sweetly, "He's just had a long day, haven't you bad boy?" Queen scowled. She had information that would significantly worsen his day. "Hey, Izuku," Toga said with excitement, "do you want to know what our plan was to bust you out?" Although Midoriya remained silent, his eyes flicked ever so slightly in her direction. "We waited until midnight for the graveyard shift to arrive. That's when they have the least amount of cops, you know. Then I disguised myself as a police officer and got the key to the holding cell. Then Dabi showed up and turned all of the cops to ash, even the head detective." When she brought up the death of Detective Tsukachi, Midoriya's right eye flinched. She smiled at this response. "But do you want to know the best part? We used Twice to create a clone of you so that Dabi could burn it to ash. That way when he's done burning the whole place down, they'll think that you died in the fire as well. Isn't that great?" Midoriya remained silent. "I think he's brain dead." Good riddance. Due to his conflicted personality, he made both remarks twice. Queen kept driving back until she eventually arrived at the headquarters of the League of Villain Dive Bar. As Queen drove off, Toga waved goodbye to her and escorted Midoriya outside. Toga was shocked to discover that Dabi had defeated them on their way back to the base after she had entered the hideout with Twice and Midoriya following. He remarked, "Took you long enough." From ear to ear, Toga grinned. "We took the scenic route." Tamura sat at the bar and squinted at Midoriya, who was still not responding. "The boss wants to speak to him in private," Tamura stated, "but it seems like it will be a one-sided conversation." Kurogiri created a dark portal with a snap of his fingers, drawing Midoriya into the emptiness. All for One was sitting in a chair when the oddball boy abruptly reappeared in a completely dark room with very little lighting other than a single ceiling light that lit up his frame. His mask obscured his face, but it looked like he had multiple medical devices attached to his body. Midoriya stood with a look of indifference, but a tinge of interest. As All for One started to say, I see that my team managed to free you." Midoriya remained silent. "I am saddened to hear that you lost a mentor of yours during the escape. That is most unfortunate. Please believe me when I say that it was not my intention for him to perish." The boy suddenly became aware of it. "How did you know that he was my mentor?" "Izuku Midoriya, There is nothing about you that I do not know, All for One retorted. Although Midoriya believed that was not possible, he recalled that his hero analysis notebook contained his name. Given his full name, a man with All for One's connections could easily find out as much as he wanted about him. And because he was also aware of his domestic problems. In relation to which, Midoriya said, twitching his thumbs while looking down. He asked, is my mom okay? Did she receive the money? The silence lasted only a moment, but long enough to unnerve Midoriya. All for One started off by saying, I regret to inform you that I have some disturbing news. Midoriya tried to brace himself, and his eyes widened. When my associate, Queen, who you know as Queen Bee, attempted to deliver the briefcase of money to your mother's doorstep, she found the door unlocked and your mother unconscious on the ground, unresponsive. Midoriya's eyes widened further. What? There was a note on the kitchen counter, detailing how she lost the only two people in the world who mattered to her the most, and that she didn't want to continue living. Midoriya fell to the ground. No, your mother attempted to take her own life by overdosing on medication. She is currently hospitalized and receiving treatment in the psychiatric ward. No, this isn't possible. Midoriya posed a rhetorical question. I'm in hell, aren't I? All for One remained silent. All Midoriya wanted to do was what was right. That was all. One of his mother's checks bounced as a result of his father ceasing to answer her calls and texts and to send her money. As a result, Midoriya had very little time to save up enough cash to pay the mortgage before his father managed to contact him and his mother once more. He was forced to enlist the aid of All for One. After that, he becomes involved in a shootout and chooses to prioritize his mother's safety over his own. He will serve jail and prison time to make sure she never has to worry about money again. However, All for One helps him escape his holding cell, but in the process, his mentor is reduced to ashes. Furthermore, his actions were a contributing factor in his mother's suicide attempt. I'm dreaming, Midoriya said, her face expressionless. It was all so unreal. It didn't feel real. It seemed like a strange world. Why do bad people get good things? Why was this sick joke of a life? A joke, indeed. A faint smile slipped across his face. Midoriya glanced up at All for One and asked, this is a joke, right? Once more, All for One remained silent. Isn't life a joke? The biggest joke of all was being quirkless. Midoriya got to his feet and straightened out. Is what has been done correctly? He didn't have to worry about his mother being kicked out, at least. The hospital would provide her with 3 meals a day, a bed to sleep in, and the best care in the world. So perhaps it all worked out in the end. Ironically, it was humorous. So funny, in fact, that Midoriya started snickering at the idea. That chuckle then developed from that snicker. That laugh then developed from that chuckle. A howl of uncontrollable laughter. All for One offered Izuku a formal position. He had to assist Queen in overcoming her biggest challenge, a gang of vigilantes, in order to help her with her trigger deals. Izuku was shocked to learn that the city was still rife with vigilantism. One could argue that vigilantes were pointless in the long run since the emergence of professional heroes. Some, on the other hand, might counter that they were not subject to penalties or regulations because they were operating illegally. They both had a similar objective, though, and he wanted to assist All for One in achieving it. To make the world a better place. Why can't I help Tamura? He's planning an attack on UA, isn't he? Izuku responded. At the moment, he was by himself in the League of Villains headquarters, using a monitor to communicate with All for One. He was compelled to assist Queen rather than join the rest of the League in organizing their attack on UA. He wanted to know why it had to be him, but he had nothing against helping her. I can help plan the attack. I'm the one who wrote the notebook that is filled with information on most of the pro-heroes' powers, remember? Izuku demanded. A soft chuckle from All for One caught Izuku off guard. As All for One remarked, My, you seem eager to spread some carnage, Izuku Midoriya, why the sudden change? Izuku's face became dejected. You know why, he said to himself as he reflected on his mother and his deceased mentor. In addition to society failing him, he had failed them. All for One and the League of Villains were the only people who helped him when he needed them. He desired to pay it forward. Izuku started to say, I owe you everything, and I want to prove myself to you, as his voice grew ominously low. I owe nothing to heroes. I have nothing against them, but I have no love for them either. I am apathetic towards them now, Izuku told the truth. To him, the idea of genuinely murdering a hero was alien. The idea of killing someone was hell. However, he might have some plausible deniability if he planned the scheme and stayed out of it himself. All for One wisely remarked, in some ways apathy is far more sinister than hate. His words made Izuku tense, but he remained silent. According to All for One, but what I require of you to do is something that only you can do, Izuku, they started. If you want to prove yourself to me once and for all, then help rid Queen of the vigilantes that are impeding our progress, stated All for One. Izuku gave All for One a nod, but he then squinted. And what exactly does that mean? Queen mentioned to me that she was peddling drugs called Trigger. They make quirks stronger at the cost of the user's sanity, right? So what's your end goal? To build an army? He inquired. Trigger is simply the first step, added All for One. The next logical step should be clear, is it not? If we can manufacture a drug that can enhance quirks, then... Izuku concluded, then we can create a drug that can take away quirks. Precisely, each person said. By train, the Naruhata ward was about 2 hours away from Tokyo, and by car, it was about an hour away. Sitting in the passenger seat of Queen's all-black sedan, Izuku gazed out the window. Queen gave him a fleeting glance every now and then, but she remained silent. At last, she made the decision to speak. She asked him, "How are you holding up?" Izuku wasn't sure if she was genuinely interested in him or if she was merely trying to strike up a conversation. "I'm okay," said Izuku. For a moment his thoughts drifted to his mother. An additional second went by, and a faint grin appeared on his face. "You know it's funny," Izuku started to utter. "I wanted the money to help my mom so that she wouldn't be evicted from her home. I didn't want her to be homeless. But now she's in the hospital, a new home, all because of me." He laughed at his own claim. "That's funny, right?" Queen scowled as she looked toward the future. "Hilarious," she uttered dryly. At nightfall, they eventually reached Naruhata. The trip to Izuku felt longer even though it was actually quite short. He hardly ever left Tokyo to visit another ward with his mother. He recalled a childhood trip he took to see a relative with his father. Queen parked close to a building after driving the vehicle to an apartment complex. After exiting the vehicle, Izuku followed her to her door, which she unlocked and motioned for him to come in. Her apartment was not what he had anticipated. Izuku pictured Queen's home as a muted space with minimal furnishings. Instead, he discovered that her apartment was incredibly clean and organized, with a number of adorable dolls and figurines arranged against the wall. She threw her arms wide and cried, "Welcome to your new home." Unlike how she was during the parking garage shootout, her happy smile was bright and innocent. It helped Izuku realize that, in reality, she was a young adult rather than a ruthless drug lord. After saying, "Go ahead and make yourself at home, I'll be right back," she went to her room. Izuku sat down on one of her beanbag chairs to do just that. After a brief pause, Queen left her room carrying 3 pictures. She sat down in front of Izuku and presented them all to him. "These are the 3 vigilantes that have been a thorn in my side," she said, pointing to a photo of a woman wearing an outfit reminiscent of an idol from pop culture. She was dressed in a black one-piece leotard with a smaller opening in the back and a heart-shaped opening in the middle of the chest. She had her hair pulled back in pigtails and a black mask over her eyes. "Her name is Popstep, and her quirk allows her to leap extremely high in the air," Queen said. "That's it?" Izuku questioned. Her response was, "That's all I could gather." Then she gestured to the following image. The image showed a middle-aged man wearing a long trench coat, jeans, boots, a tight-fitting dark shirt, and a simple wraparound mask tied over his head. He had brass knuckles on his fists. "His name is Knuckleduster," Queen started to utter, "and he doesn't seem to have a quirk." Izuku's forehead raised. "He doesn't have a quirk at all?" Queen gave a headshake. "He's just an extremely strong, quick, and resourceful old man. But he is by far the most dangerous out of the 3, Queen said. She then gestured toward the last image, which seemed to show a boy who wasn't much older than Izuku. Queen started to say, "This annoying guy is called the Crawler. He can slide across surfaces by touching it in 3 different places, and he can stick to walls." Izuku went on, "And he is an All Might fan." There was no readable expression on his face. He clarified, "I had the same hoodie as him. Does he wear this when he's on patrol all of the time?" Izuku inquired. When Queen said, "Every single time." "Why?" In contemplation, Izuku cupped his chin. "Naruhata is a small ward. There aren't a lot of retail stores around that would sell hero merchandise except for Marukane department store," he murmured. Queen's head cocked. "How would you know that? Have you been here before?" Izuku gave a headshake. "No, but All Might merchandise is rare to get a hold of because it's so popular. He either owns several, or he recycle one pair over and over again, which seems unlikely. Meaning that he must be getting them from somewhere. That somewhere being Marukane. It was the only department store that I saw that seemed plausible enough to sell that kind of merchandise on our way here. So what are you going to do? Wait at the department store and hope that he shows up? She inquired. Not at all, he smirked slyly at her. But let's just say that a few of your thugs were to trash the place. Guess who would show up? The crawler, smirked Queen too. Her eyes gleamed with bloodlust as she leaned closer to Izuku. This was going in a direction she liked. Instead of destroying them all at once, Izuku preferred to separate them one by one. After just 10 minutes in the city, he had already come up with a strategy to divide and conquer. She leaned closer and closer until Izuku could feel her breath tickle his nostrils. And then what do we do? She asked. He didn't realize she was near him because he was too preoccupied with his scheme. We have to reveal his identity first. I think that I can get close to him by pretending to be a raving All Might fan that is then taken hostage by one of your cronies, Izuku said aloud. Yes, everything was starting to fit together. And then what? Queen was practically jumping up and down with excitement. Finally, she would be able to get rid of one of the problematic Naruhata vigilantes. Izuku said, I'll improvise from there, and shrugged. Queen gave him a narrowed look. Come on, tell me, she said, giving him a shoulder rub. Some things are better left done on the fly. On this lovely morning in Naruhata, Koichi Himawari was walking through the streets, en route to a nearby convenience store to purchase a drink. He woke up much earlier than he would have preferred, but he was unable to return to his sleep. He sighed in defeat and left after discovering that he had nothing in his penthouse refrigerator. He heard a commotion outside the convenience store where he was waiting in line to buy his drink. A number of people were running away from the Marukane department store. He went outside, worried, but not before putting his drink back where it belonged. There, he heard a man proclaim that a gang of thugs was robbing the Pro Hero Collector's store. Officers were en route to the location. They ought to have been, anyway. However, Koichi heard no sirens at all, for whatever reason. I suppose I have no other option. After running into an alleyway, he removed his bulky gray hoodie to show off his All Might Hero costume hoodie underneath. After pulling his goggles out of his pocket, he covered his head with his hood. Okay, time for the show. He dropped to his knees and sprinted toward the department store, his body sliding against the floor as he went, his speed equal to that of a bicycle. Because apparently the police were busy with something else. As he approached the store's entrance, he witnessed a few thugs in all black, wearing ski masks and carrying pistols, try to stuff all of the Pro Heroes' collectible apparel into trash bags. Why did they care so much about them? Maybe because they could sell for a lot of money on the illegal market. Whatever the situation, he needed to stop them. He wouldn't have dared try to take out thugs with guns if it had been a few years ago, but now he had much more experience. If he was holding back, he could slide on all fours roughly as quickly as a bike. He could, however, move much more quickly if he so desired. When he fell to his knees, he slipped behind a clothes rack and out of the thug's line of sight. Then, moving quickly across the ground, he clipped him in the ankle and fell to the ground. The other thugs started shooting at him, but they couldn't get a good view because the crawler kept moving in zigzag patterns throughout the store and using various clothes racks as cover from time to time. A thug roared, "That's it, enough games," to his ears. When Koichi peered out, he saw a thug snatch a young, shy-looking adolescent boy with a lot of unruly hair around his neck. A gun was aimed at his head. "Come on out right now before I splatter the boy's brains all over the wall." The crawler's face twisted. He didn't seem to have many options. He had to make sure the hostage survived. He hadn't heard a single siren yet, but maybe he could wait for the police. Placing both hands up, he started to say, "Okay, you win, just don't shoot the kid." He couldn't blame the teenager for looking scared. "You're a smart man. Now come over here," Scrappy thrust style. The thug flew backwards and struck the class register after a repulsion beam from the crawler's hand struck his sternum. The boy bounded toward the crawler, who took hold of his hand and used his 2 feet and the remaining hand to touch the ground. With the boy in hand, he yelled, "Hold on tight," and drove off. Fortunately, the thug's aim wasn't particularly impressive when they tried to shoot him. The crawler turned abruptly into an alleyway when he noticed a few police cars finally making their way to the department store. The vigilante said, "Phew, that was a close one," and released the boy's hand. He appeared both shocked and a little uneasy. He was not to blame. The boy was involved in a frightening circumstance. The boy stumbled, fumbling with his thumbs. "Thanks for saving for me, but who are you?" The crawler gave him a sincere grin. "Just your friendly neighborhood crawler. What's your name?" The teenager extended his hand to shake his savior's hand. Izuku Midoriya. Why? Why was his death necessary? She loved her brother dearly. Despite their differences, she had a deep affection for her older brother. Of course, they were not always in agreement. She was more carefree than he would ever be, and he had a very strict code of ethics and behavior. Still, though, he belonged to the family. He was also Tokyo's top detective. He's gone now. The structure he was in was reduced to ashes by fire. Every prisoner in custody, every police officer present, and even Tsukachi himself were reduced to ashes by the fire. Not even a body remained for recovery. However, one thing was evident. It was murder, and her only responsibility was to prosecute the murderer herself. In order to start her own investigation, she first needed to collect more information. She never received any private information from her brother. He was too much of a traditional police officer to do that. However, there was someone she knew who wouldn't mind breaking the rules a bit. Hello? Is this All Might? When she said, Makoto? He sounded shocked. Maybe he thought she would still be upset about her brother's passing, much less call him. I am sorry for your loss. Your brother was a fine detective, the best that I ever saw. I still can't believe that he's gone, said the Almighty. Makoto forced herself to smile while biting her lip. Thank you, All Might. I know that you and my brother worked closely together, and that is why I am calling you. There was a moment's silence. What do you want to know? My brother must have been investigating something big, very big. He had to have been on the cusp of a breakthrough. Did he tell you anything? All Might said, keeping his chin cupped. The last time I spoke with him, he said that he was concerned about the drug trigger spilling into the streets of Tokyo. As far as I knew, the Naruhata ward had that problem. Makoto also cupped her chin. She was aware that Popstep, Knuckle Duster, and Crawler had been battling hard to stop the trafficking of Trigger. But did they miss something crucial? Why were they unaware of Trigger's attempt to enter the Tokyo market? To the best of Makoto's knowledge, Queen and the Villain Factory lacked the means to sell drugs to a metropolis the size and scope of Tokyo. She must have had some strong allies if she made an effort to do so. Allies who might wish to get rid of a motivated investigator who was pursuing them. Makoto said, Thank you, All Might. I know where to begin my investigation. Wait, Midoriya, is it? Please call me Izuku. Right. Izuku. You said that you were being chased by Queen's thugs because you know too much. The boy gave a nod. Izuku had been taken back to his apartment by Koichi. If he left him to his own devices, he would feel bad. But what if he was caught? Or worse, killed? He couldn't permit that since it would be on his conscience. Koichi sat down opposite Izuku and asked him, so, what happened exactly? While offering him a cup of tea. Well, I used to peddle Trigger for money. They told me that my job would be harmless, that all I would be doing is making deliveries. But once I realized what was really going on I left, Izuku said as he took his bearings. Izuku's voice trailed off, and now I'm being chased down. Not even you be safe with me. No one is. Koichi scowled. He was unaware of Queen's evil intentions when she enlisted gullible high school students to carry out her dirty work. To what extent would the Villain Factory go? From using drugs on defenseless bystanders with peculiarities to now exploiting teenagers looking for a part-time job, Koichi was appalled. Don't worry, Koichi said, putting his hand on Izuku's shoulder. You're in safe hands, because. For his benefit, Izuku concluded, because I am here. The two boys looked at each other and laughed heartily. They were both taken aback when there was an unexpected knock on the door. Koichi raised his head and walked toward the front door. He remarked, I wonder who this could be. Izuku made the decision to switch on the television in the interim. A couple of impromptu villains, civilians who suddenly turned violent after being injected with the drug Trigger, had a nasty altercation with the police, according to an incident that was already covered by the news channel. That clarified why Queen's thugs' destruction of the department store delayed the response of law enforcement. As Izuku had intended, his next objective was to approach Koichi and the other Naruhata vigilantes as closely as possible before destroying them. He had not yet devised a strategy for carrying out their death. It seemed extreme to kill them. To go over that line, he would need to be desperate. Perhaps he would let Queen do the cleaning instead. Upon opening the door, Koichi was taken aback to see a tall woman with long jet black hair, dressed in heels, dark gray slacks, and a black sweatshirt. Her bangs were matted against her forehead, and her face was haggard, giving the impression that she was in mourning. Makoto? Koichi gasped in surprise. He would have cleaned up if he had been aware that she was coming. With a bright smile, she said, It's good to see you, Koichi. She managed to smile at her brother despite the tremendous amount of suffering and heartache she must have been going through as a result of his untimely and tragic death. Koichi nearly burst into tears. I'm sorry, I never got a chance to give you my condolences, but I thought that it would be best if I gave you some space, Koichi said. Makoto touched his shoulder with her hand. It's okay. There's actually something that I want to talk to you about. May I come in? Why yes. Koichi exclaimed as he eagerly moved aside to let Makoto into his apartment. After he shut the door, Makoto removed her shoes and entered, only to discover a strange boy watching television within the living room. Oh, Makoto, this is the boy said, Izuku, to refresh his memory. Right, Makoto, this is Izuku. Izuku, this is Makoto. Izuku bent down to meet her gaze. Nice to meet you. Makoto gave him a quick smile. Likewise. Izuku was sitting in front of the television in the living room when Koichi poured Makoto a cup of tea and set it on the table. Koichi then sat down and gestured for Makoto to follow suit. So, what brings you here, Makoto? The woman scowled as she glanced at Izuku. She hadn't anticipated Koichi's company. She wanted to talk about something personal. Sadly, it appeared that she would have to return at a later date. I wanted to speak with you about a few things, but it appears that you're already busy. Wait, Koichi said abruptly as he rose. He turned to face Izuku, who cocked his head to the side, and asked, Is it about the villain factory? Makoto winced. Don't worry. I was actually already discussing it with Izuku here. I saved him from a group of thugs that worked with the villain factory. He was coerced into working with them, Koichi told her. Makoto sat down in front of the table and let out a breath. It appeared that she would not need to return. I have reason to believe that Kuin and the villain factory have begun peddling Trigger into Tokyo. That's why my brother was killed. At her statement, Izuku raised an eyebrow and Koichi's eyes widened. Koichi was speechless, saying, wait, for real? But how did they manage to infect the city? He, Popstep, and Knuckleduster put in a lot of effort to stop Trigger from spreading. However, to learn that they had not only failed, but that their own error indirectly caused Detective Tsukachi's death. They must have aligned themselves with some powerful allies. Allies that are a lot more cutthroat than even Kuin can be, Makoto said with a chin raised. Izuku held up his hand and said, was your brother a police officer by any chance? One of the few that were caught in the fire? No, Makoto snapped back. Izuku breathed a brief sigh of relief. He wasn't a police officer, he was a detective. Izuku's eyes widened and his face lost all of its color. Makoto noted his red face in his mind. She moved closer to him and put her hand on his, saying, You wouldn't happen to know anything, would you? Please, if you know anything, tell me. What do you know about Detective Tsukachi's death? Izuku turned his head away from her. I don't know anything. All I know is what I've seen on the news. Makoto squinted at him before abruptly releasing his hand and getting to her feet. I see, I'm sorry for pressuring you, she replied. Even though Izuku avoided looking at her, Koichi couldn't help but sense that they were at odds with one another. Makoto said, I apologize for bothering you too, but I'm going now, and he moved to the door. However, she glanced at Koichi as she did so, and he got up to greet her. Thanks for stopping by, Makoto, and for letting me know about the expansion of Trigger. I'll be sure to let Knuckleduster and Popstep know as well. We have to double our efforts in. Koichi. Makoto interrupted him with a raspy whisper. That kid, Izuku, he was lying. He knows what happened to my brother. Koichi's eyes grew wide. Seriously? He exclaimed as he turned to face the boy in the living room, who was glued to the television. Again. After that, Koichi looked back at Makoto and gave her a quick glance. Koichi defended him by saying, but still, maybe he has his reasons. What if he was the only survivor that was caught up in the incident? Makoto asked, then wouldn't that be even more suspicious? An entire police station burned to the ground, not witnesses except for a kid, a teenager at that, being the only survivor? Why would they let him live? Koichi folded his arms and pondered, but regrettably, he was unable to provide a good explanation or justification. She put her hand on his shoulder and said, I'm just saying, Koichi, be careful, before turning to leave him and waving goodbye. Koichi gave her a backward wave before shutting the door. He then proceeded to the living room, where Izuku was still watching television. Makoto warned him to exercise caution after she caught Izuku lying, which must have happened when she touched him to activate her polygraph trick. Was Izuku, however, truly unreliable? As he watched the news, Izuku continued to analyze his conversation with Makoto. That woman was the sister of Detective Tsukachi. She was dangerous because of that. Why? Because the human lie detector was one of Detective Tsukachi's peculiarities. He was able to infer the truth from you after touching you. She must have had a similar quirk because that was his sister, and siblings often had similar characteristics. The worst thing would be if she touched him on purpose to apply her quirk to him, indicating that she was aware of the reality. She was aware that his statement was false. Fortunately, that did not imply that she was aware of why he had lied, however, still. "Hey, Koichi," Izuku said, turning to face him. What is it?" inquired Koichi. He asked him, "What was your visitor's name again?" Koichi questioned him. Makoto." "Why?" Izuku made a show of being shy. "Oh, she's pretty is all." "Tsukachi Makoto, huh? I'll remember that," he pondered. Kuin had followed Izuku's instructions. Several blocks from the department store where Izuku was held captive, two impromptu villains terrorized a gas station. The police swiftly flooded the area after arriving on the scene. There was another annoyance, though, that was also there. Knuckle Duster. He suddenly appeared and struck his face with one of her pets. One blow was enough to bring down the tall, stout, towering lackey turned villain. The vigilante with the bandana then quickly took down and defeated her other lackey. Kuin couldn't be surprised, but she was a little let down by how fast her henchmen were defeated. Those with quirks that were at least somewhat helpful were better suited for Trigger. Unfortunately, that was one area where her two pets fell short. One was born with a quirk that gave him webbed feet, and the other had a quirk that allowed him to see farther than the average man, about 500 yards. Nevertheless, they fulfilled their function. Her cell phone rang as she was returning to her apartment. She looked up the caller's ID. She recognized it as her co-conspirator, Deku, as he now preferred to be called. "Hello," was Kuin's enthusiastic response. She was curious about the juicy details he extracted from the crawler. "Kuin, I'll meet you back at your apartment. There's something that I need to discuss with you." "Oh, do tell," she said, eager to hear his thoughts. After saying, "I'll explain more at your apartment," Deku ended the call. Kuin returned to her apartment in a short time. She headed to her front door after parking her car in the assigned space. The door was already unlocked, much to her dismay. She entered suspiciously and got one of her bees ready to sting the would-be intruder, only to be met by Izuku making herbal tea. "Hi." He smiled and waved naively at her. Kuin gave the strange boy a disbelieving glance and called her bee back. "How did you beat me here, and how did you get in without a key?" he replied. Izuku started to pour his prepared tea into a cup for her to sip. "I picked the lock, and I got a ride from the crawler." When Kuin yelled at him, "What did you say?" Izuku swiftly raised his hand to reassure her. "He doesn't suspect anything," he said as he started to walk toward her while holding the teacup. Despite her previous outburst, she graciously accepted it when he handed it to her. "I know his name, and I even know where he lives. In fact," Izuku said, giving her a big smile, "he trusts me completely. I've even been inside of his apartment." It was Kuin's desire to leap on him. Indeed, she almost did. Rather, though, she combed the boy's unkempt emerald green hair. He enjoyed the feeling very much. Kuin moved her hand sensuously to the back of his neck and then, like a cat, stroked the base of his chin. "Kuin, good boy," she said. "You're a very good boy. Now all we have to do is kill him, right?" Izuku gently pushed Kuin's hand away from his chin as he jolted out of his daze. He wanted to talk specifically about the issue of his removal. Izuku started to explain. "Well, it won't be that easy, much to the drug lord's dismay. Did you know that Detective Tsukachi had a sister?" Kuin casually nodded at him as she settled herself on top of one of her beanbag chairs. "Yay, what about her?" "I met her at the crawler's apartment," Izuku stated. The female drug dealer gestured for him to stop wasting time, and "She knows," said Izuku. "When she touched me she asked me if I knew anything about her brother's death. I told her that I didn't know anything more than what I saw on the news. Afterwards she left immediately. She came by to speak to the crawler about your organization partnering up with All for One. She knows that we are connected to the police station where her brother worked and burned down." After consuming the remainder of her tea, Kuin placed her cup on the coffee table. "What does her touching you have anything to do with her knowing that you lied?" "Oh, that's right. You didn't know, did you?" Kuin raised an eyebrow. "Know what?" Detective Tsukachi had a quirk. He could tell if someone was lying or not by touching them and asking them a question. However, he rarely used it since a confession by quirk wouldn't be admissible in a court of law. He always needed to obtain cold hard evidence first, Izuku said. And as you know, siblings have a tendency of having quirks that share similar traits. Meaning that his sister must possess a quirk that operates similarly. She might not know why I lied, but she might know that I did lie, Izuku speculated. Kuin questioned, what do you suggest that we do about it? She had an idea, and it was a straightforward one. Why not just get rid of her and be done with it? It would be too costly for them to allow her to expose them. Izuku sighed deeply and sorrowfully. He never thought he'd say it, but we have to eliminate her. Kuin gave him a fiendish smile. He was talking her language now. Koichi had informed his two allies, Popstep and Knuckleduster, of everything Izuku had told him. They were as surprised as he was to discover that the villain factory had joined forces with another strong, evil group to increase Trigger's influence. They had to plan their next course of action and decide what they wanted to do with the information they were given. To put it mildly, Makoto's brother's passing was regrettable. He was a fine detective indeed, based on what she had told him. He was the greatest of the best, and the villain factory was not known for such audacious and brazen actions as burning down a police station and killing a detective. They needed to be stopped because their new friends were dangerous. In light of this, Koichi made the decision to arrange a meeting at his apartment with both of his partners in arms. The first person to arrive was Popstep, who ushered her inside and smiled warmly at her. Koichi said to her, thanks for coming on such short notice, Kazuho. She wore a loose-fitting schoolgirl uniform. Her glasses were thick and, to put it mildly, unflattering, and her hair was disheveled, wild, and untamed. She essentially looked like the complete opposite of her Popstep persona, but that was the point. She entered the house and sat down in the living room without saying anything. Koichi also took a seat, and they didn't speak to each other for a few minutes. Koichi assumed that she was still in shock over what he had told them, even though it was awkward to say the least. Until she finally said something. Her words, he's late. Koichi blinked briefly. Then he understood she was referring to Knuckleduster. Yay, he said, his voice trailing. Then all of a sudden, someone knocked on the door. Then there was another knock. Additionally, Koichi's front door was knocked off its hinges before he could get to his feet. Ah! My door! He cried in surprise as he tried to pick it up again. A tall, well-muscled man in a business suit with a disheveled face and a noticeable scar on his left cheek was the one who knocked on his front door. The man roared, I have news, and dashed into the living room. Kazuho let out a moan. Be quiet, oh wow. You're distracting. It was shoddy work at best, but it would do for the time being, so Koichi propped his front door against the gap it was supposed to fill and bowed his head in sorrow, considering the trouble he would have to endure to have it fixed by maintenance. However, when one invited the vigilante Knuckleduster to their home, that was to be expected. Koichi went back to the living room and sat down, while Oao stayed upright and Kazuho sat opposite Koichi, wearing a displeased expression. What's the big news, then? Koichi inquired. Oao gave a sheepish smile after blinking. News? Oh, I should have mentioned that I know a little bit about the villain factory. Kazuho and Koichi were listening intently. Well, I just so happened to run into a couple of impromptu villains the other day. And I was able to make the connections after you told me your story, Koichi, Oao said. What are you saying? Koichi questioned him. Izuku, the boy you met, may hold the secret to everything that is happening, in my opinion. Imagine that Kuin starts a huge firefight in the middle of the street when he arrives, unleashing two impromptu villains. Before you saved him, Izuku, the boy, was on the verge of being imprisoned or worse. Oao put his hand on his chin and said, it can't be a coincidence. After years of fighting crime and investigating leads, Koichi had to admit that Knuckleduster was much smarter than he had imagined and never ceased to amaze him. His deduction skills were nothing to be ashamed of, but he wondered what he meant when he said that Izuku was the key, and if he was also suspicious of him. Well, Makoto seems to think that Izuku knows more than he's letting on, Koichi replied. After a brief exchange of looks between Kazuho and Oao, Koichi went on. She used her quirk on him when she stopped by the other day while he was here with me as well. Though in a somewhat solemn tone, Koichi remarked, I don't remember what she asked him, but she told me that he had lied about the police station incident where her brother died. They had bonded over their love for All Might, and he sensed that perhaps the quirkless teenager wanted to get involved with being a police officer, or perhaps even a pro-hero. They had not known each other for more than a day, and he couldn't understand why Izuku would lie. Wasn't he in danger, and if so, why didn't he refuse to lay low at his apartment for a while? If he knows more than he's letting on, then maybe he was there when it happened, Oao stated. Koichi nodded his head in agreement. Yay, that's what I thought too, he said. But why would he travel all the way to Naruhata if he was already in Tokyo, where the incident occurred? Kazuho cupped her chin. Maybe it was to escape whoever was chasing him, Koichi defended Izuku. Yes, but why is it here? She underlined. When she asked, Koichi could only shrug and say, maybe it was a random decision. We must find the truth about this before anyone else is harmed, regardless of why he came here. The individuals pursuing him are bad news and will do whatever it takes to achieve their objectives. We must work twice as hard. Iwao clenched his fist and yelled. Kazuho and Koichi both gave a nod of agreement. Makoto spent most of the day trying to decipher the intentions of the young adolescent boy she had met at Koichi's apartment. She was certain that he had lied, and whether he had a quirk or not, she could tell by his expression when she introduced herself as the sister of Naomasa Tsukaoichi, and her quirk only strengthened her suspicions. She was aware that men were arrogant, and her brother was a perfect example of one. If he knew the truth, why wouldn't he tell her? Was he attempting to shield her from the people pursuing him? It was possible, but if he knew that Koichi was the crawler, he should have trusted him to shield him from any threats that would befall him. I miss him. She shook her head as her thoughts became grim. This was no time to feel sorry for herself. Perhaps she needed a vacation to regain her composure and return to her investigation into the death of her beloved brother. Even though it was already evening, Makoto believed that in order to carry on with her research, she needed caffeine the most. She made the decision to go into a coffee shop across the street from her house, where she noticed a boy in line, his emerald green hair unkempt, wearing a solid black button-up shirt, jeans, and tennis shoes. She apparently stepped in to assist him when he was having trouble paying for his coffee at the front desk. He turned to face her, and both of their eyes showed surprise at realizing that they had met before. Izuku was the boy. After she paid for his coffee, he gave her a quick smile, even though he appeared startled to see her too. She gave him the change, which was a quarter, because he appeared to need it more than she did. Thank you, said Izuku, bowing his head and grinning. Makoto said, don't mention it, as she bought herself a coffee and sat down at a table close to the cafe's corner. Since there were no other patrons in the cafe, it was just them and the clerk for the time being. I'm sorry for earlier, Izuku said, sipping his coffee. She repeated, I already told you, don't mention it, to him. No, I mean for lying, explained Izuku. She hadn't expected him to be honest, but perhaps he realized that it was better to tell the truth. After all, a boy who couldn't afford a cup of coffee wouldn't survive long under the aegis of a criminal organization. Makoto raised an eyebrow at what he had said. Your brother was a mentor of mine, and I knew him. He was also Tokyo's top detective. He believed that I had a talent for police work, so I trained with him in order to get into the police academy, Izuku started. I also understood that you and his sister would have similar quirks. In other words, you knew I had already lied when you touched me, he told her. Makoto nodded her head. She had a lot of questions, but she had to admit that this boy was intelligent. You weren't absent, were you? It was partially an accusation and partially a question. You were present when my brother died. I was at the police station when the villains attacked it, Izuku replied, looking down at his coffee mug. Although I didn't witness your brother's death, I did hear it. I heard them all pass away. The mood darkened as Makoto again considered her brother's last moments. How did he die? Did he fight to the end? Did he try to keep his friends safe until the very end? But the more she considered this, the more agony she felt within herself. Didn't she come here to avoid thinking about it? She noticed Izuku smiling as she took a sip of her coffee. I apologize. I didn't intend to depress the atmosphere, he remarked. You came here to enjoy your coffee. As she continued to drink her coffee, Makoto smiled empathetically at him, unable to comprehend why she was so suspicious of him. He was only a teenage boy involved in a tragic incident, and he merely wanted to spend some time with his mentor, her brother, at his police station for some hands-on training, no doubt. She couldn't fathom the horror he had witnessed that night, but it still begged the question. How did you get away? Makoto questioned him. He briefly turned his head and looked directly at the front desk clerk, saying, Oh, well, you see, I escaped because. After a pregnant pause, Makoto felt as though the room was spinning, wondering what was wrong with her. She attempted to get up to regain her sense of direction, but she stumbled and fell to the ground in a heap. She looked at Izuku, dazed and bewildered, and he gave her the most eerie smile she had ever seen, as though all he had done before had been to put on a front, an act, and the face she saw must have been his true self. Because I'm a villain. The Naruhata vigilantes were on the move, and the crawler and his two friends, Knuckleduster and Popstep, patrolled the city. His ear was haunted by a foreboding wind on this eerily dark night, and he had a deep-seated feeling that he was unable to fully express. There was a feeling in his gut that this would be their final patrol together. He was flanked by his two comrades, who pumped their brakes when they saw him do so, and he had been sliding across the concrete in the unusually empty city limits when he suddenly froze in his tracks. "What's the matter?" Popstep questioned him, unable to read his face because she was standing behind him, but even so, his fear was expressed more clearly by the stillness of his body than by words. "Do you not sense it?" he asked her. Popstep and Knuckleduster looked at each other, and Knuckleduster swallowed hard. Well, was she the only one who didn't notice? What did they notice that she didn't? "It's your instinct for survival. Police officers have experienced similar things, so it's in overdrive," Knuckleduster explained. "You can detect her scent more easily the longer you play with death." The crawler nodded his head. Knuckleduster's remarks were moving, and while he agreed with them, he couldn't help but feel that their current predicament was completely different. They were missing so many pieces of the puzzle, but they still made the decision to go to Makoto's house to share information with her and see what she had discovered. He was certain that it was a good plan, but, the crawler replied, "I guess you're right," and then he got down on all fours and continued on toward Makoto's apartment. The three did not speak again. Izuku said, "Thank you," as the barista handed him a vanilla latte. He took a sip from his cup and looked at the center of the coffee shop, where Makoto had been stripped naked except for her underwear and strung up by her arms and legs to the ceiling fan. The eccentric boy estimated that she would be conscious again in 10 to 20 more minutes. Perhaps the vigilantes would arrive in time? He had certainly hoped so. They only needed to follow the breadcrumbs he left for them to follow. Surely they were capable of doing so. He had to admit that he appreciated his handiwork, but for the time being, all he could do was keep leaning against the bar and sipping his drink. Beneath the facade of a homely coffee shop barista, the sinister smile of one of the most twisted criminals in the League of Villains was visible. "Thanks for giving me a front row seat, bad boy," the barista cooed to him, her skin suddenly melting off her body like hot wax. "I figured that your talents would come in handy, Toga," Izuku said matter-of-factly. Her ability to disguise herself was a valuable quirk, and Izuku wanted to make the most of it. The quirkless boy knew that Toga had an unhealthy obsession with him. He could not say why or how it manifested, but he would use it to his advantage, not only to help him carry out evil plots, but also to get answers to questions that had been bothering him for a long time. "Hey, Toga," Izuku said, setting his coffee mug back on the counter and turning to look at her. She leaned over the counter and smiled brightly, flashing her canine teeth. "Yes." Izuku leaned in closer as well. Their noses almost touched, and he could feel her breath tickle his nostrils. She gazed at him, her eyes focused on his emerald irises. The deranged villain seemed to have been in a trance or dream. "Did Queen ask All for One to put me in touch with him?" Quiet. His question hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, and Toga's enthralled stare became even more intense, but it was nothing compared to Izuku's leer because his eyes were glazed over, as if he was looking through her rather than at her, and it made her skin crawl, and she loved that feeling. No one else on Earth could make her shrink beneath their gaze like him, and she knew that he had the capacity to do so deep down. The fact that he recognized his potential for insanity while looking through the veil that All for One tried to put on him was just the cherry on top. As soon as he joined the League of Villains, Toga made up her mind that her life was in his hands, and oh, what capable hands they were. She knew that he was a rebel and a bad boy at heart, and his cheerful smile did little to hide the intensity of his gaze. It was fun to break him in, but it was pure joy to rebuild him. No, it was even higher than that. He was more alluring to her than ever before, and when she extended her hand to touch his cheek, he did not recoil or turn away from her touch. Rather, his eyes stayed true and unwavering. Toga gave Izuku a sensual thumbs up on the lower lip, wishing she could have him here, now. But maybe that would have to wait. "What if I let you know that he did?" With a wry smile on her lips, Toga responded to him. But before Izuku could say anything, Makoto moaned behind him, looked at her, and then returned his focus to Toga. He reached into his pocket and pulled on a single black glove to cover his right hand. "Let's table this discussion for another time," he said. "For now, it's time for business." Makoto opened her eyes slowly, her vision blurry, the room spinning, wondering where she was, what had happened to her, and why her head was so foggy. She recalled the advice her brother had given her years ago, that she needed to maintain her composure to cut through the fog of confusion that grew inside her head. She took a deep breath and then slowly and intermittently expelled the air, and then she opened her eyes again, and happily her practiced ritual of clarity paid off, realizing that she was still in the same coffee shop. But why? Hey, you're conscious. She heard an excited voice and turned to see a teenage boy with emerald eyes and unruly green hair. She also noticed his single-gloved fist. That went really well, didn't it? Makoto couldn't understand what the boy was saying, and when she finally tried to move, she saw that she had been strung up to the ceiling fan like a deer about to be killed. What? Why did it take her so much energy to speak? Her voice was hoarse and low. Izuku clarified, I only used 8 milligrams of xylazine, also known as horse tranquilizer, because even 16 milligrams could be fatal. The speed at which it became effective shocked me. So he had drugged her. Why? And how could he talk about it so coldly? Makoto suddenly remembered what had happened to her. She was sitting down with this boy, Izuku, as his name was, and that was the last thing she remembered. He spoke as though he were explaining his science project to a class of his peers, and it was eerie and unsettling. Kuin's resources made it easy to obtain the drug, but Izuku was worried that even the small dosage he gave her would be enough to put her into a coma or kill her before he could use her. Izuku circled her and examined her face. She was still, to put it mildly, disoriented, but he was more than happy to use her as a test subject. Why? This boy couldn't have been older than 16, yet he was a villain. How? Why? What happened to him? What led him down this path? Makoto managed to ask, but she was unable to comprehend it. Though it appeared to be a mocking gesture, Izuku put his hand under his chin in thought. Did you know that 80% of people have a quirk of some kind? Izuku inquired, knowing that Makoto was aware of the statistic despite her lack of response. Everyone was. Therefore, the likelihood of a child being born without one is 20%. However, Izuku went on to explain the obvious. If both of the child's parents have a quirk, then the likelihood that their child will be born with one increases exponentially. My parents both have a quirk, but I don't. Sadly, I was dealt a bad hand by fate. What do you think about the treatment of people who don't have quirks? Even if she could talk more, what could she say to him to help him return to the path of righteousness? Nothing at all. Makoto didn't answer, primarily because she couldn't because of the effects of the drug, but Izuku took her silence as confirmation. When Makoto bought their drinks, she gave him a quarter, which the curriculous boy removed from his pocket with his gloved hand. Let's see what fate has in store for you, then. Toga will kill you if I flip this coin and it comes up heads. If it's tails, I'll let you live until the inevitable vigilantes show up. Your chances of surviving are pretty much equal. That's a better chance than I had of having a quirk from birth and leading a typical life. Izuku grinned and exclaimed, unable to contain his laughter at the irony of his words, which caused Toga to join in. Izuku flipped the coin into the air while maintaining the same joyful smile on his face. He held his gloved palm open, and the boy's smile grew as the coin fell into his palm. Looks like it's heads. Makoto's apartment had a letter left in it. The letter described Makoto's thoughts during the entire ordeal, including her belief that Izuku was suspicious and that only he knew the truth about her brother's sudden and untimely death, but she also happened to have discovered a plot that Kuin was planning to carry out on the city's subway station, with the apparent goal of bombing the station. The letter did not go into detail about how Makoto learned of this information, but it was concerning enough that she hadn't returned from her coffee shop run, which she also mentioned in the letter. In any case, their next course of action was straightforward. Knuckleduster and Popstep went to the subway station to confront Kuin, while the crawler would meet Makoto at the coffee shop. Knuckleduster also called the police and asked for a bomb squad to disarm any explosives they might encounter. He arrived at the coffee shop in a matter of minutes because the crawler was moving at top speed on all fours, and even though it was almost time for closing, the lights were on and the open sign was still up, but from where he was, he could see Makoto waiting for him at a table. Normally, at this time of night, the lights would go out and a worker would be cleaning up. When he stepped inside after pulling back his hood, Makoto greeted him with a kind smile but also appeared a little unkempt. Makoto remarked, I'm happy you found my letter. Though he didn't expect anything less from the sister of Tokyo's best detective, Koichi was astounded by how far ahead she thought, and her deductive reasoning was on par with her brother's. Koichi trailed behind Makoto until they arrived at the women's restroom, where she said, there's something that I want to show you, and beckoned for him to follow. In here, said Makoto. Koichi entered without hesitation after she held the door open for him. What did you discover? Koichi questioned her. In there, Makoto said, indicating the bathroom stall in the center. When Koichi opened the stall door, he noticed that the entire toilet was covered by a sheet. Bewildered, he pushed the sheet aside and discovered something horrifying. There was a human head inside the toilet. His face lost all of its color, and when he looked back at Makoto, He saw her skin melt away from her body as though she were shedding it like a snake. The heel of Koichi's foot brushed the toilet's base as he stepped back in horror, and when he looked inside again, his eyes widened and tears started to fall from his irises. No way. Makoto had owned the head, then. Who stood before him? All thoughts ceased to exist. The crawler's brain had stopped working altogether. Because he had been decapitated by Toga in one swift motion. Oh no. Pop Step wanted her hair pulled out. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Fortunately, the bomb squad had been on the scene when she and Knuckle Duster arrived at the subway station, but there was only one minor issue. 2 bombs were present. Since it was thought that there would only be 1 bomb overall, the bomb squad was only assigned 1 explosive ordnance expert, but the fact that there were 2 made matters considerably more complicated. The only bright spot, regrettably, was that all of the civilians had been evacuated. Pop Step noticed a message flash across the subway's LED screen in addition to the fact that there were 2 bombs on either side of the station. The code to disarm Bomb A will only appear after Bomb B's timer has reached 7 seconds remaining. According to the ordnance expert who had arrived on the scene, Bomb A had the potential to cause the most collateral damage because it was attached to a pillar that, if it collapsed, would create a sinkhole big enough to drag several buildings under and possibly injure and kill hundreds of people. When Pop Step explained to the expert over the phone what kind of explosive Bomb B was, he informed her that, in contrast, Bomb B was a relatively mild explosion that must have been intended to kill or maim 1 person. All right, so they were prepared from the start. However, with only 1 minute remaining on the timer, neither Knuckle Duster nor the explosive ordnance expert had enough time to make it to her and back without dying in the explosion. Knuckle Duster must have seen what she had seen on the display screen, along with the rest of the bomb squad. She therefore had 2 options. If the ordnance expert manages to disarm the bomb, hundreds of lives could be at risk, but if you leave now, you might be able to save her. Alternatively, she could risk her life to save hundreds of innocent civilians by texting Knuckle Duster the code, which would allow him and the bomb squad to disarm Bomb A. Simple choice. No luck yet, huh? Pop Step told Knuckle Duster over the phone. He paused for a moment before responding to her. The wiring has been intentionally tied into a linchpin, which will activate the explosive if it is pulled. Additionally, the only way to cut the correct wire would be to pull on it to initially create enough slack for cutting. Pop Step let out a sigh. So I have no choice then. No. Knuckle Duster interrupted, saying, have faith. There are still 45 seconds remaining. Perhaps we can find a different route. However, you just stated that disarming it would require activating it. Isn't texting you the code the only safe way to disarm it? He was interrupted by Pop Step. Knuckle Duster remained silent. You know, said Pop Step, I really enjoyed working with you and Koichi. I'll treasure the memories. It was bittersweet in a way because she never imagined herself leaving in a blaze of glory to save countless lives, but the tears that started to fall from her cheeks and onto the concrete pavement below were tears of joy rather than sadness. She never thought she would be a hero when she passed away. When Knuckle Duster said, please, don't talk like that, his voice was barely audible above a whisper. Was he also crying? There are 20 seconds remaining. Really, it's been enjoyable, Pop Step said, now prepare to receive the code. Knuckle Duster wiped his face on the other end of the phone and instructed the explosive ordnance specialist to position himself so he could enter the code. As Pop Step started to say, oh, and could you do me one last favor, Knuckle Duster? Yes. Anything at all. To her, Knuckle Duster cried out. Please tell Koichi I'm sorry. There are 10 seconds remaining. Okay, so the code is, there are 7 seconds remaining. The code that appeared on Pop Step's bomb's timer. 7, 6, 9, 1, 1. Pop Step gave him a code, which Knuckle Duster repeated. Bomb A disarmed after the ordnance expert entered the code, and Bomb B went off in the distance.
I will continue this story in next part. Till then, bye bye.